3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone. This is Thersites the Historian. I'm joined by Sean Chick, and tonight we're going to be taking a look at World War One. We're doing sort of a general overview where we will go country to country and consider the nation's path to the war, their general strategy, i.e., what they were hoping to accomplish. We'll talk about what kind of resources they had on hand in general terms. We're not going to be going into hyper specifics when it comes to the details of that, but we'll just give you a general idea of how strong they were. We will talk about how the war went for them and their fate after the war. We will be mostly ignoring some of the minor powers, say Bulgaria and Romania. We'll mention them, but we're not really going to go into depth. And we will go country to country and look at them in that order. And we'll start out, though, by talking about the sort of general path to World War One and what it was like. So, Sean, perhaps you could guide us through that.
Okay, I know we still have the super chat book thing from 2 weeks ago, right? That we're carrying over.
Yeah, and we still have 2 individuals with 10 and 1 with 5. So,
gotcha. So we'll still be continuing that, of course. Any questions that you have? I know we don't have a lot of comments right here, but what do we got here? Seth Becker. Oh my God, I can't wait to hear Sean rant about things while drinking a fifth of Jack Daniels. Well, sir, you need to know a few things, Seth. First off, I rarely drink Jack Daniels. Okay, that's beneath me. Yeah, I'm just messing. I'll drink it a special at a bar. But I'm about as sober as they come right now. How about you?
I have a thing of bourbon, but I haven't touched it much yet.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I don't know. Maybe. I just came fresh from a game of Paths of Glory, which, if anybody's played, is a Ted Racier design, GMT published. Excellent World War One game, although it needs some modifications to make it a bit more historical, but just a really well-made game, very back and forth. I'm playing the Kaiser in this one. We'll see how it goes.
To quote Ted Racier when he's defending his products, nuh-uh, it's already perfect.
Yes, Ted Racier, known for his for being emotionally put together or something. I don't know, man. He can be a kind of a jerk, but he's a great designer. You know. Anyway, so we'll be going country to country. But you want to talk about the origins of the war first?
Yeah, just for a bit. I mean, I'm sure almost everybody here will know that already, but just to make sure that people know sort of about some of the interlocking alliances and how, had the war started a few years earlier or later, it might have been different in terms of who was on what side. So,
yeah, it'd also be very important when we get into Germany to discuss the degree to which they are guilty for the war starting, if you will. That'll be a big one, of course. And yeah, just to let them know, yes, we are definitely still doing a giveaway. We're just collecting money from 2 weeks ago to determine who gets a book or two this time, okay? So just making that one clear. But yeah, we can talk about the overall path to war. It's worth keeping in mind that when this war starts, there had not been a European-wide conflict in 100 years since the Napoleonic Wars. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, you didn't have wars, Franco-Prussian, Austro-Prussian, wars for Italian unification, Crimean War, and all those conflicts, of course, are very important. And the Austro-Prussian War in particular could have been dragged out. That one actually might have mutated into something more on the scale of World War I. But that just hadn't happened until 1914. And so getting into why, there's so many reasons given. Some people will get into things like the fact that there hadn't been a war in so long, that people kind of forgotten about how horrible war was, and there's this idea of that going to war would be this like great, exciting adventure, if you will. You still had romantic notions of war. There's also a theory I like a lot that all these European countries had spent the 1800s gobbling up Africa and Asia. And once they ran out of territories to conquer, they turned on each other. I think there's got some relevance in there, particularly when you consider Germany in their position as an empire. Uh, anyway, you got any thoughts, Thersites?
I mean, I have to say that there is that thing that all the high school teachers like to show or share. What is it called? It explains World War One in the context of a bar fight.
Yes.
Um, as silly as it is, I think it's basically accurate because it was about interlocking alliances and secret agreements and a system of diplomacy where the goal was not to produce peace or any specific outcome, but rather to be more clever than your opponent. So World War One is where being too clever by half gets you. It gets you stuck in the
Yes.
trenches with rats and feces and trench foot,
I think
periodically
it's
being
also.
blown to pieces by artillery and machine guns.
I think another reason too. I think another thing that like leads to this war is if you say like a kind of a diplomatic miscalculations, right? That's what I say. That's what I say. It's there is no one power in Europe that is strong enough to to mitigate the rest, right? To really control. In other words, like Britain was the most powerful country in the 1800s, but by the time you get to World War One, their power is they're on the decline. Now they're not on a steep, rapid decline at this point, but they are no longer the economic giant they once were. They are being overtaken by America and Germany. And I do believe that World War One is also happening in part because there is a growing power vacuum, if you will, in addition to your great power competition, and the fact that there's a lot of parity between these countries. I mean, with very few exceptions on this one on of the nations we're going to go over, if one of these nations had fought the other one on one, I mean, who knows what would have happened, with the possible exception of Germany, because Germany by that time has large population, economic powerhouse, and the overall best army amongst all the powers. Although it should be kept in mind, all of the armies in this war go into this conflict with major flaws in their doctrine, Germany included. Germany just has other advantages, such as their staff work, if you will. You know, so
Also,
anyway,
one weird thing. I mean, I guess if we ever come back and do generals of World War One, we'll see it even more. But I've noticed that a lot of the senior commanders, especially the famous people, Petain, Cadorna, Hamilton, a lot of the senior dudes in this war from pretty much every country were guys who'd retired a few years before 1914, were then recalled, and then given some of the most important assignments.
oh,
And I
that's
can't think of any
interesting.
other
Yeah,
war where that's the case, where almost everybody who becomes famous, or at least half or so, were guys who were retired when the war broke out.
yeah. You know, yeah, well, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Yeah, Patan's an old man by this war. I mean, the guy lives to be like almost 100, right?
Yeah, I think he almost died of pneumonia or something like that during the winter at Verdun. So, I mean, he was already in his 60s and everything else. And then 20 plus years later, he's leading France for the Nazis, or at least Vichy France.
I like the story where when he got called in to go to Verdun, they had to knock on his mistress's door. That's where he was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at least he was still a vigorous old man.
He was no, he. Everybody says he was a vigorous old man. You know, he's still it's good mental faculties, and of course, Patan is one of the finest commanders of the First World War, no doubt about that.
Yeah,
Uh,
not that there were that many good ones.
Not that there are many good ones for any of these countries, really. I mean, I guess Germany generally has better ones, but I mean, even they've got some real knuckleheads, right?
Yeah, I mean, I
But
think a lot
anyway,
of it is that the pace of advancement in terms of technology had changed the way that battles were fought on the tactical level, and all of these guys were older, so they really had no appreciation of that. Not to mention, as you said, there hadn't been any major wars, so they hadn't seen the impact of industrialized armies slugging it out, and they had no idea how to break the trenches in the West. No one ever broke that code.
no, they eventually did.
Well, I mean, they figured out how to
Um,
break it, but not without taking horrendous, unacceptable casualties.
Very true. Both in 1918, the Germans had it figured out, and the Allies did it to the Germans. But in all cases, the losses are very heavy, naturally. Um, That being said, it should also be kept in mind that the wars that had happened before had also ended rather quickly. So, literally, when you got guys like the Kaiser saying you'll be home before the leaves fall, he's actually not being that far off to people's experience. The Franco-Prussian War lasted maybe a year and a half. The Russo-Japanese War the same length of time. So this idea that it was going to be like a quick war, that actually wasn't a stupid idea. And you could actually make an argument that World War One very well could have ended in 1914, if not for the Battle of Tannenberg. Because if you look at it, the Central Powers are involved. There's four major fronts in 1914. There's the Schlieffen Plan and Germany's invasion through Belgium into France. You have the Austro-Hungarian attack on Serbia. You have the fighting in Galicia between the Russians and the Austro-Hungarians. And then you have the Germans versus the Russians in East Prussia. The Central Powers lose three of those four fronts pretty badly in the case of Serbia and Galicia in particular. However, they're able to win Tannenberg. And there's an argument to be made that if let's say the German Eighth Army in East Prussia had been destroyed, mauled, or the Russians are marching through East Prussia, the Central Powers actually might have been like, okay, it's over. But not only do they win Tannenberg, they win big. And when that happens, the Germans readjust their strategy and said, okay, we'll win in the East and we'll just hold the West. And that was essentially Germany's strategy all the way till the fall of the Tsar and the Kerensky government. So anyway, that's something to bear in mind. I will say that I do not mock these guys for thinking the war would be short. Most of the wars have been short up until then. But yeah, tactically, they had a lot of problems. It should also be kept in mind that the way the technology had advanced was in such a way to favor defense more than attack. With the nature of entrenchments, machine guns, and it'd be hard to coordinate attack because the communications technology wasn't as good. The automobiles were not as robust and as numerous as they needed to be. Same thing with aircraft. And it should be noted that as the technology is getting better as the war goes on, they're learning to integrate the technology more. By 1918, the armies are starting to be very effective on attack, although casualties, of course, are still very heavy. That doesn't mean that World War I generals don't have knuckleheads. I mean, God, I think 2 of the 10 dumbest generals in all of world history are in this war. Luigi Cadorna and Konrad von Hotzendorf. All right? I mean, these men are straight up butchers. And they have other competition as well. Douglas Haig's a moron. I don't care what the revisionists say. He's an idiot. He's a blockhead ramming his forehead on a trench, okay? He likes to do massive, 3-week barrages that just tell the Germans exactly where he's going, So I do want to make it clear, there are quite a bit of idiots here, but don't think every general in World War I's a moron, and these guys are definitely learning as it goes on. And it should be kept in mind by the time 1918 rolls around, Hotzendorf and Cadorna aren't calling the shots anymore, So well, there's that.
Their home countries decided they couldn't afford the butcher's bill. I mean,
yeah, that's certainly. Do you want to read off some quick super chats and then we'll start getting to the countries?
Sure, we can go back and do that real fast. Diogenes sent one, $5. Hey y'all, still doing the giveaway. Also, read up on any philosophy lately. We are doing the giveaway, and I believe you had a previous submission, so I think this puts you at $10.
Yeah. I haven't been reading any philosophy. I'm now doing Civil War book reviews for Emerging Civil War, so I've got a book on Vicksburg. I'm reading a book on Wilson's raid through Alabama. I'm reading a book on the Texas Revolution, Battle of Goliad to be precise. And some George Orwell essays and some historical essays by George Washington Cable about Louisiana history. What about you?
I have not read much philosophy lately, although a couple of the books I've been reading as I've been trying to get through my current chapter have dealt with a few of the philosophers, mostly in an indirect way. It will probably be several more months before I have the freedom to read anything that's more purely philosophical. I actually have a deadline this Friday to finish another chapter, so this week will not be a very good one in terms of reading things. although I will be
Okay.
writing things. So
Well, that's a good part. We have Elliot Dowd, $10. Thank you very much. To what degree do you think observation of the American Civil War affected strategy or doctrine in World War One? Uh, Europe did not ignore the American Civil War. The von Moltke definitely didn't. The great German commander, the one who was victorious in the Austro and Franco-Prussian wars. Uh, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, von Moltke actually met McClellan and discussed amphibious operations with him because of the Peninsula Campaign. And apparently, Moltke was impressed with American amphibious operations. That said, there really wouldn't have been much for them to learn. The American Civil War was not some innovative experience. The most you could say would be the railroads, but armies were already moving towards integrating railroads in the movement to begin with. I would probably say the only thing that they could have learned would have been about entrenchments. But there's no evidence they did that anyway. So I don't know. This idea that if only these World War I generals had studied the American Civil War, there's really no evidence for it at all that I've seen. So I don't think it had much of any effect, really. And I don't really see the Civil War as being a good analog or even a prelude to the First World War outside of Petersburg. Because Petersburg is a situation that has some things in common with World War I, but even then, not exactly, really. If anything, Petersburg probably has a bit more in common with extended defensive lines in the War of the Spanish Succession than it does with the American Civil War. One thing should be said, though, the American Civil War, a lot of people in that war thought the South would win just because of the sheer size of the territory. And the North was able to do that in no small part because of the use of railroads. So I will say that there were observers who paid attention to some of the stuff in the war, but it wasn't considered that important. And by the time World War I starting, it's like 50 years in the past. So anyway, a few thoughts on that one. And did we just get another one in? Yes, we did.
Another one from Diogenes. I feel like probably the Civil War was something they studied, but if I had to hazard a guess, the thing that would have influenced them more would be the Franco-Prussian War.
Yes, definitely. Also, the Russo-Japanese War. There were a lot. They were trying to draw a lot of lessons from that.
Yeah, I think that was also a pretty big shock to everyone's system, and apparently that more than any other single event really screwed over Russia's standing in the international community.
Oh, yes.
Russia's prestige went straight down the toilet.
And domestically as well. But we'll get into that one. Diogenes, $10. Nice. Glad Sean's learning the story of my people. I think that he means the Texans.
Oh.
Also, what countries would y'all say have the best military track record from, say, Napoleon to World War II? That's a tough one. What do you think?
The best track record for that period as a whole, well, I would say Germany to an extent, even though they didn't win the ones that counted the most, but their military did well. But then again, they weren't really around for the first third of that period. And when they were just being used as cannon fodder by Napoleon. Russia was on the winning side of most of its wars, even if they took a pounding and their quality wasn't always the best. Britain, I guess it would have to be Britain, right?
I couldn't go with Russia because of the Crimea, but also they lose World War One. World War One is the war where a significant chunk of the alliance loses the winning alliance, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, Britain's a good contender for that. They had a few colonial misadventures in there, but they won both world wars. You had the Falklands War, of course, as well. I'd say Britain and Germany are pretty good contenders. America, of course, all these countries also have notable defeats as well,
Yeah.
and even disasters. Like in the case of Japan. Germany has two disasters. I mean, they punch above their weight, of course, but they do lose horribly both times, right?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't hand it to the U.S. in this case just because, I guess, by the criteria we've established in the past, not seriously challenged in the same way that some of these other countries were.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I guess I'd go with Britain as well, like what you said. Yeah.
I mean, Britain was consistently successful, had consistent quality, even if they were never quite the best of the best. They had both land and sea, and eventually air power to the point where they were at least competitive with the best, or in the top two or three at any given time. So, I think they're probably the most consistent.
What about small countries?
In terms of small countries, actually, Greece did pretty well during this period. I mean, they won their War of Independence against the Ottomans, which is kind of crazy. Because Greece at that time was almost completely depopulated and had basically no leadership. I mean, fucking Lord Byron was there as the paymaster for Britain, a poet. I mean, to be fair, the Ottomans were in complete disarray in the early 19th century. The Janissary Corps was just this big rent-seeking coalition on the state that was contributing basically nothing militarily, and eventually, I think during the Wars of Greek independence, the Ottoman Sultan actually stamped them out. So there was a lot of internal dissension among the Ottomans and a lot of factors, but still the Greeks won independence. Then they won the first war, the first Balkan War. They won a lot of territory under Crown Prince Constantine. And yeah, they carved out most of their holdings that they currently have during this time period, and they pretty much, at least on the grand strategic scale, were always victorious. Pretty limited sample size because they didn't fight that many wars in total.
Although they did get overrun in World War II and was pretty brutal there.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I guess World War II almost have to exclude for the small countries because by that point, technology and your industrial base was so important for success. Whereas even in World War One, it was already important, but it was not on the same level of importance.
yeah, another one I'd also add to that with Greece is that they did very badly post World War One when they tried to extend their power into Turkey itself. They got mauled bad in that one. Uh,
Yeah.
another one to consider, of course, is Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean although the casualty rates that they suffered are horrific.
Very true, very true.
Somebody was talking about France in the comments. France, I would say maybe their record is a little bit underrated. That being said, they did have quite a few defeats, but they always fought fiercely.
Yeah, yeah. The French would be. I think the French and the Russians kind of break even, really. You know. That being said, the Italians, no, that's bad.
Yeah,
That's
it's
bad.
not a good record.
It's not a good record, guys.
Because there's
Um,
both the adventures of Cadorna, you also have the glorious campaigns in Ethiopia, which that by itself,
oh
either
yeah.
one of those things by themselves would almost be disqualifying. World War II as a whole was not pretty for them, especially the North African campaign. There's just too many defeats. It's not to say they didn't have some individual successes or great units here and there or whatever, but overall, that was not a good national performance.
No, no. I think the only, off the top of my head, the only period where did very well was 1918 when they got rid of Cadorna and they brought in Diaz, who was a very good general. Um, that's about the Italian army at its peak, really. Is 1918.
Somebody asked about
Uh,
Portugal. I actually don't know that much about Portugal's involvement. From what I understand, they just kind of fed troops into the British trenches, right?
Yeah, they got targeted pretty severely during one of the 1918 offensives because the Germans realized the Portuguese corps was suffering from like high sickness rates and low morale. That said, I can't remember his name right now, but there was a Portuguese machine gunner, if you will, who essentially like held back a German division on his own or something insane. I mean, maybe not division, but he held back a lot of men on his own and won like Portugal's highest medal. So there is that. I can't remember his name off the top of my head though. But yeah, I've seen him on lists of like where there'd be like most badass soldiers of the 20th century. I've seen him on those lists along
Oh,
with that Finnish sniper who was the one called White Death,
the guy
and
from
yeah, that guy Mad
Stalingrad.
Jack. No, you're thinking of the one from Enemy at the Gates. No, this is a Finnish sniper. In the Winter War and the Continuation War, I think killed hundreds of Russians or something. There's also Mad Jack Churchill, who's the British guy winning the Battle of the Claymore, and then you've got Portuguese machine gunner.
Yeah.
I usually see those three on the list.
So, I guess the question now becomes, which country do we want to start off with?
Well, do you want to start with Allied or Central? It
Um,
might be it might be best to start off with Central Powers. Now that I'm thinking about it, just because the while of course some of these other countries play their own roles in making the war happen, the consensus seems to be that it's kind of Germany and Austria's fault, or Austria-Hungary to be precise.
yeah. All right. Well, which one would you like to begin with?
I guess we start off with the big boy, Germany.
All right, Germany then. The realm of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was
Yes,
basically
indeed.
identical with the Russian Tsar and the English king to the point that they could exchange uniforms and no one could tell the difference.
It's like they're all inbred or something.
Yeah, I mean, it actually is amazing. There's that famous picture where they have exchange uniforms. Unless you read the caption, you'll have no idea which one I'm supposed to be which. Because they're
Well, that's
literally
the
all
one
three
they have like
triplets.
got different hats on and stuff. I can kind of tell. I can tell the difference though with the way the mustaches are for the Tsar and the Kaiser.
And
Um,
I guess I didn't look that close, but literally, if they'd just been willing to make some minor changes to their facial hair, the Tsar and the Kaiser could have gone up to each other and said, "Hey, kind of tired of this whole Russia thing. You want to switch places? All right, let's go in this room together. When we walk out, we'll each go replace the other person, and no one would have ever been the wiser."
so in the case of Germany, do you have any thoughts you want to start off with?
I think up to World War One, clearly Germany had the most military success overall in recent history. So since the 1860s, they were basically unbeaten. They had built up a navy for the first time in their history. It was still pretty untested and was not yet as established as, say, the British fleet, but it did have
Yeah,
quality.
I do
Um,
want to add something about the high. I want to say this about the high seas fleet real quick because this is something that I really think is not they're not getting enough credit for. Uh, Germany in less than 20 years built the second largest navy in the world, whose warship designs were generally as good and in many cases better than the British, and was also able to have like excellent sailors and very good admirals as well. And this isn't a country with some naval tradition to draw from. It's sort of insane, really. I don't know of any other country in the world that built a first class fleet so quickly. And, while the Battle of Jutland, for instance, was definitely a strategic victory for the Allies, tactically, I would say the Germans won. They inflicted double the number of losses, and their fleet maneuvers were, especially when they were trying to evade the British, were pretty damn flawless. So I don't know. Do you know of any like? Do you know of anything quite like that? I mean, is any country in the world just built a navy out of nowhere almost?
the Romans during the
Okay, so
First
we got
Punic
the
War.
Romans. Okay, so we got the so not since the Romans of the First Punic War had a nation built a fleet, a first class fleet, this quickly.
Although, actually, the Athenians, after they found the silver mines at Laurium, they already had a navy, but it wasn't all that big, and they at least doubled it in the next 3 years prior to the Battle of Salamis.
Okay. The only example I know of in the last 200 years is the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s. But the only issue with that is the Soviet Union did already have a decent sized fleet and whatnot. The Germans really are creating something from almost nowhere, you know. Um, so yeah, the Soviets. I mean, it's the best example I can think of. But even then, it's what the Germans able to accomplish with the High Seas Fleet is insane. And now, at the same time, of course, building this first-class navy makes them a more direct rival with Britain, which increases the tensions with Britain already. And so one could argue that by building up this great fleet, of course, they increased the tension at the time. They made sure Britain would be their enemy, and the fleet was never strong enough to be able to fully take on the British Navy, the Royal Navy. But I'm just talking about from a purely technical organizational achievement. It's one of the greatest in military history, I think.
Yeah, I think it's up there probably.
You go from being navally insignificant to being, I'm the second most powerful fleet in the world, and except for the Royal Navy, I can pretty much sink any of you bastards.
Yeah, and something that really enabled that is that Germany had, aside from the United States, the greatest industrial capacity in the world.
Yeah.
They were really heavily industrialized, so they could produce all of these modern weapons, including warships, at a much greater rate than almost any of their rivals. So in a one-on-one situation, Germany was heavily advantaged over any one opponent. They also had a pretty large population. I don't know the exact numbers, but I think they might have actually had the largest population outside of Russia.
Yes, they did. They had the largest outside of Russia. Of course, their industrial base, which also makes them a rival with Britain. Berlin at this time is starting to become a banking rival to London. That's going to be cut short by the war, of course. I mean, America, of course, had the potential to build more ships, but once again, the U.S. Congress isn't going to give them that much money because, the Americans are wary of having an empire, and up until the 1950s, America pretty much tries to avoid having a massive standing army. If anything, the fact that the U.S. had such a large fleet, even that was a bit against American tradition, if you will.
That's because we'd had Roosevelt in office, and TR was a bit of an imperialist.
Yeah, I mean, well, to be fair, I mean, the U.S. Navy in general, if we're talking about all the military branches of America, the most impressive overall is the U.S. Navy. All right, they have probably the best overall record. And yeah, Theodore Roosevelt had really put a lot into the Great White Fleet. And there had been the Navy. The Navy gained a lot of the spoils of popularity from the Spanish-American War, with Dewey and the battle in Cuba. I can't remember the name of the Battle of Santiago, which, I mean, the Spanish didn't have much of a chance, but that didn't matter. I mean, hell, they made board games out of it. Yeah, that's right. One of the first war games ever made was for the Battle of Santiago. But anyway, so what I'm saying is that the United States was definitely a naval power and an emerging one. They could have been stronger than Germany, but Germany is, of course, the generals have much more political influence. Right.
Yeah.
Anyway, so no, high seas fleet, very, very powerful. The German army does have some doctrine troubles with their army, especially in attack. However, they have very good artillery, and of course, their staff work is second to none.
Yeah, I guess they were also among the first, at least, to really have a formal war college system and all of that, so they systematically studied war in a way that most of their rivals did not. I mean, granted, Luigi Cadorna's genius was native to him, so he didn't have to, but most people have to read about these things and study them to become effective.
The other one too, yeah, oh God, man. If you ever want to read something really sad, read about officer training in the Italian army before World War II. I mean, you'll be like, yeah, no wonder you guys lost, right? But yeah, the Germans have their staff college work. They have to. They do emphasize tactics and operations, though, but that's because Germany is always trying to win as quickly as it can because it's surrounded and doesn't have good defensive terrain.
Right.
Yeah. So the German idea is you would have to. The Germans did have a lot of debates between who do you go after, Russia or France, right?
Yeah.
And the general idea was you would knock out France as fast as you could because you just could because the way the distances were, and then once you did that, you could concentrate on Russia. And there's already thoughts in Germany of the idea of creating an empire in the east, if you will. And Germany's also emboldened by how poorly Russia had done in the Russo-Japanese War.
So I
But
guess they
one should
weren't
also
worried
keep in
about the
mind,
Russians taking them from behind while they were embroiled in France.
yeah, the other thing too is the degree to which Germany is responsible for the war is interesting debate. Um, on the one hand, Austria is making its demands on Serbia. I've read that in 1912, during the Balkan crisis, Germany had thought of intervening, and apparently the Kaiser's generals told him, no, 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 wait for an excuse in 1914, then we can get involved. And partially this is because in Germany, their thought is we are surrounded by an alliance between France and Russia. And the Russians are in the middle of modernizing their army. Russia, they thought, would be ready by 1917 at the latest. So the time to strike is now. The time to start a war is now. And this is somewhat similar to Hitler's thinking in 1941, because Hitler also knew that after the Winter War, Stalin is modernizing his army. And that Stalin's army was probably going to be ready by 1943. And who knows, at that point, maybe Stalin invades Germany, right? I mean, it's possible. But Stalin is definitely modernizing his army and getting it ready. And so in Germany, the other thought is we must fight with Russia before they're ready. What was very important from the stuff I've read too was for Germany to declare war on Russia before doing anything with France. And partially had to do with socialist parties in Germany. Because they believed the only way to get the socialist parties in the Reichstag to agree with the war was to fight the Russians, because if you're a left-winger at this time, Russia is the evil, conservative, reactionary boogeyman among all the countries.
Right.
And so declaring war on Russia and saying that Russia started it, if you will, is a way to get the socialists on board. And this, by the way, created a real crisis amongst the left and socialists and communists at the time, because what they were seeing with the First World War, in particular in Germany, was they were seeing these socialist left-wing parties subordinate themselves to nationalism and the need to win a war. Now, of course, those parties will later on play a part in the 1918 revolution, but at least for the first few years of the war, they're on board. And that was very demoralizing for a lot of people on the left, you know?
Yeah, I think from what Wells was saying, but also some other things I've read, the labor movement was very much focused on international solidarity. But so a lot of the leaders were very disheartened that their workers rallied to the colors as soon as war was declared.
Yeah, exactly.
Although I guess actually, if anything, the Wobblies in the U.S. might have been the biggest holdouts. The IWW, because they opposed the war and the public sort of turned on them for it.
Yeah, they were always the most extreme of the labor movement. Am I correct on that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wish the IWW would make a comeback, but that's, I guess, a bit out of the scope of what we're talking about.
A man can dream. Who's that guy who was into East Tennessee history?
East Tennessee? I think you're thinking of
He was in the program with us.
a student, you mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He liked the Wobblies. He was into them.
I don't remember.
No. So no, that's Germany's position. They need to win knockout blows. In many ways, it's interesting. We think about Germany going after France so hardcore in the Western Front, but in many ways, Germany's strategic plan is we're going to beat the French, but mostly we're here to dismember the Russians. And that becomes especially big after 1914 because Schlieffen plan fails, but hey, we've won at Tannenberg. So Germany's strategy for most of the rest of the war is going to be concentrate on knocking those Russians out, hold the line in France and Belgium. You know, the only big departure from that, you know, until the fall of Russia, is Verdun. That's the only big departure. Is why I mean, the idea of the Germans launching a major offensive in the West. I think that's the only one really from 1914 to 1918. A major offensive, and I'm not talking about when they did counterattacks to try to reclaim land like in the Somme. But I just mean like as a strategic offensive. But anyway,
Ah. Yeah, because now you
you got
mention
any
it,
thoughts?
most of the battles I can name on the West were Allied counterattacks.
Yeah, it's mostly Allied offensives. Nivelle offensive, Somme, um, variety of offensives in 1915 where the French army really gets chewed up. Uh, but yeah, no. So that is Germany's situation. One thing I think is very fascinating about Germany, though, is when you really get into the details of it, the Kaiser is actually a restraining influence. Uh, he starts to question if they should even be going to war. The generals, of course, overrule him. There's a whole thing about the thing with the timetables, where the Kaiser said maybe we shouldn't do this, and they're like, that if we stop that, we'll mess up our train timetables because they were that precise.
I haven't heard about that.
Yeah, but here are some of the big ones. The Schlieffen Plan did call for marching through the Netherlands because there's a tiny slit of land in the Netherlands that gets in the way. And the Kaiser explicitly said to that, no, you do not attack the Netherlands, only Belgium. Now, this had the effect of compressing the German advance through Belgium through a narrow corridor, but ultimately that was to Germany's benefit. The Netherlands was one of their main trading partners because they're adjacent to them, and that's where the Kaiser gets to hide out for the rest of his life, you know?
Yeah.
And so think about it. If the Kaiser said, yeah, you generals are right. Let's go invade the Netherlands over a tiny slit of land just so we can make this offensive more efficient, he couldn't have hidden away somewhere. Um, the Dutch would not have been there as economic trading partners, which was more to Germany's benefit, you know?
Right.
So if you're really looking at Germany in the course of the First World War, the Kaiser is the restraining influence,
From what I
not the
understand,
generals.
didn't his influence wane from the start of the war to the end and sort of steadily diminish?
Yeah, by essentially by 1916, Germany is a military dictatorship in all but name. Hindenburg and Leutendorf and God, who was on Hoffman and the rest, they were really the ones in charge at that time. Uh, the Kaiser could be involved in some strategic discussions. Like they didn't keep him completely out the dark, but ultimately they were the ones calling the shots. God, if I'm not mistaken, I think the Kaiser even said maybe we shouldn't do the unrestricted submarine campaign against Britain.
Huh.
I think I got to look that up, but yeah, like it's I want to say that again. It's hilarious. We think of the Kaiser as this crazy, unhinged guy, and I think the Kaiser Wilhelm II is very fascinating, much more nuanced man than he's given credit for, and once again, he's actually kind of the restraining influence in Germany.
Yeah. I was
It's
looking at
nuts.
the map I have pulled up here, and I'm just noticing how none of the dots are on the capitals of the countries. Because at first I thought that's what they were going for, but I suppose that can't be it unless they don't know geography at all. Anyway, that was a bit of an aside. But yeah, no, the Kaiser is an interesting guy, and I think it has become something of a trope, especially in general histories, to say that Wilhelm II was unwise, and that's basically why Germany got into the war. And I guess he was a big promoter of imperialism, and especially promoting imperialism in school. That's true. But then people point to, well, he fired Bismarck. That was his key mistake. The thing is, he fired Bismarck. Bismarck died. 15 more years pass, and then World War One happens. So if he had kept Bismarck around to the end of Bismarck's life, I don't see what difference that would have made in the grand scheme of things.
Well, Bismarck was also much older, of course, and by that time, Bismarck was becoming more in favor of repressive measures within Germany. And to the Kaiser's credit, he was somebody who believed that he was a ruler of all Germans, and so his idea of government was much more coalition based. And if you think about that as well with the Reichstag and the socialists, he's not trying to browbeat them into things. He wants to bait them in to supporting the war and to give them certain perks and benefits. So I think the Kaiser also, when he got rid of Bismarck, I have to be honest, I think Bismarck was on the verge of making some major mistakes in Germany. Bismarck, brilliant politician, of course, superb diplomat and everything, but he's not flawless, and he is becoming like essentially a really old, grumpy man by that time. If the Kaiser could be blamed for anything, that's getting involved in imperialism, authorizing the High Seas Fleet, and while he is a restraining influence on his generals, ultimately he is interested in getting involved in a war. So restrain influence, sure, but he's not going to stop it from happening.
Yeah, I feel
You
like
know.
he got them to the brink of war, and then he realized what he had done, but by that point it was too late. The wheels were in motion, and all he could do was make a couple of moderating influences on the edges.
Yeah, exactly. So ultimately, a weak ruler. I wouldn't even call him tragic per se, though.
No, I don't
Um,
have much sympathy for the Kaiser, but I will say that although he is not the greatest ruler, he's still better than Nicholas II, who I guess we'll get to when we get to him. But
yes, probably so. Also, just I guess what I'm trying to fight against is the portrayal of him as an unhinged buffoon. I don't think he's that at all.
yeah, I don't get that impression either. I don't think he's particularly stupid.
He can be emotionally volatile. Like you ever read his reactions to Hitler and the Nazis? It's like what he writes and says goes from like condemnation, horror to these guys are awesome.
So he's kind of got like the Franz Halder personality.
Yeah, I know he is he's not a cartoonish buffoon, but he is definitely a bit emotionally unstable and very reactive, I would say as well.
Might be from all of the interlocking branches of his family tree.
So no, that's the situation Germany finds itself in the First World War. I, I don't know if I'd say any one country causes the war. Germany's not stopping it from happening, and in fact, the generals see 1914 as their best chance. Because at the same time, the German army was doing some of its own. I don't want to say reforms necessarily, but the German army was considered to be at peak readiness in 1914. Yet another reason why Germany's going to declare war on Russia, why they're going to let the situation in the Balkans get to where it is, why they're not going to restrain the Austrians when they definitely could have. Right?
Yeah.
So, anyway, you want to move on to Austria?
Sure. So Austria-Hungary, with the possible exception of the Ottomans, might be the most complicated one of them all, just because of what a mess their country was overall. I mean, Russia, of course, had its problems, but Austria-Hungary, by this point, after 1867, had the dual monarchy, where you basically had two separate governments under one emperor, an Austrian and a Hungarian government. And those were not the only two groups within the empire. So these are just the two most dominant groups. And apparently, the sort of federal system which linked together the two parliaments of each one did not give the emperor the authority to force one side to act in the interest of the other. So, to the point that during the war in Austria, there was something of a food shortage. Hungary had most of the empire's agriculture, and the emperor had no way to force the Hungarians to send food to Austria. So this country is a shit show all the way around. And they also
Holy hell.
they also contain many nationalities and a lot of smaller nationalities. If you look at where they're at on the map, you can see that out of this empire you get Czechoslovakia, parts of Poland. It looks like they gave up some of their land to Romania eventually. I think they also still rule Bosnia and Herzegovina, so a lot of what will later become Yugoslavia, which is then subdivided into Croatia and some other countries. I mean, look, this is a mess, and the whole idea of the dual monarchy was to give more representation to keep people happy, but clearly that was not really working. When they enter the war, they're under Franz Joseph, who by this point had been in power since I think 1848, or I might be making that year up, I don't know, but he'd been in power for a very long time, and he was extremely old. And when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, he was the heir apparent, and the only guy who really sort of had a handle on how complex this empire was, and had some sort of popularity in general that would have enabled him to govern effectively. When he dies, this then makes his, I think, brother the heir. I might be cousin. I don't do family trees. But eventually his cousin will take over after the old man dies in 1916. And it would have been at that point where he would have needed to make constitutional reforms to get more central authority over his government, and he passed up the opportunity and did his coronation on Hungarian soil to show the Hungarians that he would stand up for their prerogatives, which
Yeah.
also
By the
made
way, yeah.
effectively alienated one of his prime ministers too.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. So
Oh,
yeah, go
you
ahead.
should know 1848. He'd been around since 1848.
Okay, that's what I thought. All right.
But the thing to know about Franz Joseph II is that, uh, in many ways, he's a very successful ruler until this moment, because he was a very capable ruler, and he was very popular in the empire. And there's an argument to be made that with his death, the empire's last unifying symbol and personality was gone, and that combined with the military defeats and especially the economic devastation. I mean, probably no country in World War I is going to be more economically devastated than Austria-Hungary. All of these things combined are going to just destroy the empire.
Yeah. So another thing to keep in mind is that of their industry, 3/5 of it was near the crown lands of Bohemia. So their industry is super concentrated, but a lot of the resources are in Hungary. Most of their food supply comes from Hungary. Also, Budapest, which is the Hungarian capital, has most of the armaments, or not most of the armaments, excuse me, but probably the other 2/5 or close to it. And then they have a lot of the minerals nearby that are needed to make these weapons. They also have a lot of social inequality within the empire, and because each half has its own parliament, there are different policies in place. So Hungary in general is more prosperous, but it also has greater inequality. If you look south at Bosnia, they had literally just tried to free the serf peasants of Bosnia called the Kmets, or I don't know how you say it, but Kmets. And up to 1908, these guys owed 1/3 of their earnings to their landlord. So they had passed a law in 1908 where basically the crown would provide money for them to buy their own land and end serfdom there, but this program had been very slow to move forward. So a lot of people in Bosnia, even though their lives had improved just a little bit under the Austrians as compared with Ottoman rule, they were still thinking, you know what, we'd be better off if we were just on our own. So there are a lot of people in this empire who are not really going to participate very loyally or enthusiastically. So of all the countries involved, they might have the lowest overall morale. So that's a factor. Another thing to keep in mind is that I think of all the countries, most of them were expecting a quick victory, but I think Austria-Hungary needed a quick victory. Without a quick victory, all of the social problems that they had within would boil over and cause problems.
Also, of all the armies, they are going to be the one that proves to be the least capable of replacing losses amongst soldiers, but especially officers, because Austro-Hungarian Officer Corps actually is pretty good in 1914. On the junior level, like when you get to corps and above, you got a lot of problems, right? But as those officers are getting chewed up with the battles in Galicia and then the counterattack to try to save Przemysl, which is really one of the worst military disasters you could ever read about. I mean, men marching around the Carpathian Mountains with cardboard shoes. All right.
Yeah.
I mean, they can't recover from that. You're right. They needed it because of the social problems and because of the nature of their army as well. They just don't have a good enough system to replace those kind of horrendous losses.
Yeah, and also there's a lot of instability in the government because they're not achieving results. So the Austrians are constantly sacking prime ministers, especially after 1916 when the new emperor takes over. I can't remember his name right offhand. Charles the
Maybe it was
First.
Carl.
Yeah, or Karl
Yeah,
the First.
Carl.
So yeah, he takes over and now he's trying to search for solutions. The Austrians also engage in a lot of secret diplomacy to try to end the war, because they understand that things are fucked and their number one priority is surviving even if they end up taking some losses in terms of territory and prestige. So they enter into some very intense negotiations with the French in 1917 that fail. But then in early 1918, those negotiations, what were they called? The Sixtus negotiations are then revealed by the French in the spring of 1918, and this really undermines the emperor's credibility because it looks like he's selling out his subjects, and he kind of was, and he's also selling out his allies. Although Germany and Austria had a secret agreement that either of them could do secret negotiations so long as they informed the other, but apparently the emperor hadn't really told the Germans enough about that, so that pissed them off. Just a total disaster. And by 1918, though, the country was literally coming apart. In 1916, Romania jumped in because they thought that they had a good chance of picking up land at the expense of Austria. And before that, they were wavering because they didn't know whether they wanted to try to pick off stuff from the Russians or from the Austrians, but they decided Austria was an easier target. And that's why they entered the war in August 1916. But then when you get to, I think it's also 1916, I can't remember what part of the year, but there was an assassination of, the Austrian Prime Minister was assassinated by the son of the chairman of the Socialist Party. And this was the first act of open defiance in any of the belligerent powers against the government.
Oh, wow.
But then when you get to 1918, things are completely off the rails. In January, there are strikes in the war industry, so you got workers who are being held to starvation wages, living with limited rations under martial law. They finally have had enough, and they go on strike in a big way. The next month, in February, you have a huge naval mutiny at the city of Kotor in southern Dalmatia. And by the way, the Austrian fleet actually did well against the Italians, even though they're outnumbered. But at this point, they had also had enough. And a lot of this is compounded by the food shortage I alluded to earlier. They get their final two prime ministers within just a few months of each other. So in August, a new prime minister, Baron von Husarek, took command. And then in October, he's replaced by a professor who then surrounded himself with his other university colleagues. And they got to make history together as they literally watched their empire dissolve. So
yeah, and also the Allies really encouraged it post World War I as well.
Yeah, especially Italy, because Italy, the reason they joined the war, get this shit, okay? So before this, if you see on this map, Italy was part of the alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany, but they decided not to enter the war in 1914 because Austria had not asked their permission before going into Serbia. So they got them on a technicality. And the reason they did that is because Italy's primary territorial ambitions were things held by Austria. So stuff in Dalmatia and a little bit to their north, especially Isonzo, a place where Luigi Cadorna commanded about 8,000 offensives. So they decided that they needed a way to get into the Entente, and this was their excuse. They took it, and now they had a chance to make peace with Italy and give them some concessions to keep them at bay and out of the war, or possibly to win them back. And Germany is begging Austria-Hungary to do what they have to do. So Austria-Hungary begins to reluctantly offer up some of the territories that the Italians want. But while that's going on, in late 1914 and early 1915, the British and French are also in Rome. And they're saying, you know what? If you join us, we'll let you have all the things you want and more. And the Italians were thinking, that sounds great. And also, if the Austrians end up winning the war, there's no way that they'll honor their agreement. And up to this point, everything that the Italians had liberated from foreign crowns, they had liberated by arms. If you look at the campaigns of Garibaldi, for instance, these had been liberation movements. So there was sort of this romantic idea that we must claim our homeland through blood, not by negotiation. So a lot of the Italians are geared up to do this by military means. So although Austria-Hungary did come around to offering Italy what it initially wanted, the Italians then asked for more, and Austria-Hungary then had to reconsider, is that worth it or not? But before the Austro-Hungarian diplomats could either concede or deny the demand, the Italians declared war in the spring of 1915. So Austria then had to fight that front too.
Probably few countries entered a war with more shameless ambitions. I mean, Italy's just a bunch of jackals in this conflict.
Oh no, I mean, and they were literally bribed by the British and French. That's why they switched sides at the last minute. And apparently, though, one thing the Austro-Hungarian government had going for it is that they had broad, overwhelming support for the war against the Italians, because most of the people saw the Italians as traitors.
Oh wow.
But otherwise, morale was very low, and people didn't really care about the war. And a lot of the minority nationalities were just looking to break away.
You know, this kind of explains why the Austro-Hungarians mostly did very well on the Italian front, really.
Yeah, that was the one place where they had morale, where they thought the war was a just one.
They also, I can't remember his name, but the Italians also had, I mean, the Austro-Hungarians in the Italian front also had a very good, probably their best general of the war, army level general of the war was there, a very good defensive commander. I
Was it
forget his
the
name.
Croatian guy?
I believe he's Croatian, yeah.
Yeah, because they also, at this point, had started to integrate a few people who weren't Austrian or Hungarian into the upper echelons of the army. So they had one Croatian field marshal who was arguably their best general.
Yeah.
So if they had done more of that earlier, maybe they would have been able to keep their empire together, because they dealt in one major nationality while ignoring all the others, right? So that was kind of a problem.
Also, Croatia would have been easier one for them to do that because Croatian soldiers kind of had a legendary status in the Austro-Hungarian army.
Oh,
Oh yeah, the famous Pandors, who are these light infantry that fought in the War of the Austrian Succession, was one of the conflicts where they really gained a lot of fame, and so Croatians already had like a kind of military mystique within the empire to begin with. So no surprise they would integrate them before the other ones. Probably also helps to have the good buffer against Serbia, which we'll get to a little later. Yeah, I think that the problem in Austria-Hungary is that they made their demands on Serbia, and the Serbs accepted all the demands but one. And you really get to that point where you think to yourself, Austria-Hungary at that point could have said, okay, that's cool enough. I mean, it was pretty humiliating, right?
right.
And we'll get into the stuff with Serbia as well, but I know Germany and Russia play a very, very big role in making World War I happen. But if somebody and Serbia as well, but if somebody fucking holds a gun to my head and says, you got to blame one country, I got to blame Austria-Hungary, they could have just accepted the fact that Serbia was giving in to them 90% of their demands. But nope, they wanted the 100, which had 100% was essentially the equivalent of Austria-Hungary wants to go to war, guys.
Oh, Mr. Deicide says that pander means cop, and it was a vernacular term.
Okay. Yeah, the Croatian light infantry were very, very effective in the Age of Horse and Musket. Particularly the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War is probably their high point. But anyway, also Napoleon had a very high opinion of Croatian soldiers.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But anyway, you want to answer a few super chats, and then we'll get into the Turks, who are also complicated, or do we have more to say about Austria?
I think that pretty much covers everything I have to say about Austria. I actually found them interesting to read about. I had never really read much about their history. I tried to start at the beginning with the books I have on them, but some of the dynastic politics of the Habsburgs I just don't find that interesting. But by the time that we get to World War I, that complicated mess is amazingly interesting. So anyway, our next super chat comes to us from Diogenes again for $3. Thank you. Have y'all heard of Max Stirner, egoist philosopher?
I've heard of him, but I don't know much about him.
I have not heard of him till just now, and I also obviously have not read him. I'm also not 100% sure what egoist philosophy is.
Well, I'll write that down to look him up sometime and see what's up. C.S. Ventura for 5. Thank you very much. What do you think of Kaiser Wilhelm II, specifically how he has continued to resonate as a political figure despite his shortcomings? I guess we kind of answered that one, but it is interesting that he's remained in people's like historical memory more than you'd think, right?
Right.
I mean, if you say the Kaiser, I mean, there were other Kaisers. We only think of this guy, right?
Right.
There's only one, the Kaiser.
Even though technically
Anyway,
there were more, but no one cares about the other ones.
Yeah, but no, there's this guy, and this is definitely the Kaiser. You got any other thoughts on the Wilhelm II?
One thing I do find interesting is that, of course, when he came to power in 1888, he was still pretty young. And he had probably been middle-aged by the time World War One broke out, but he's still portrayed as this sort of young buck who has not much sense. So I think it's weird that sort of this image of him in his youth became the image of him for the rest of his life. The memory of him that people have is frozen in time.
Yeah.
I guess that I've always found that kind of interesting because he's always kind of portrayed in that way as if he's still that same young guy. The way people talk about him.
What's our next one? Again, C.S. Ventura again.
Yeah.
Austria-Hungary's military contribution is underrated. If anything, the people and army was able to hold the line after so much hardship and defeat.
Fair point.
I do agree with you. I do agree with that because if you think about the Austro-Hungarian military, they're going to suffer within less than 2 years 3 military disasters. The opening battles in Galicia, the Carpathian Mountain counteroffensive, which I think really broke their backs, and then and also the initial failed attack on Serbia, so actually 4 of them, and then the Brusilov offensive. And the fact that they are still fielding armies, holding the line against Italy, and playing a major role in the fall of Romania means the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for all of its shortcomings, definitely had a little more juice than it may look like at first. But, I mean, I guess, I don't know. I mean, the Germans, you remember that, what was that line the German staff officer said about fighting with the Austrians as your ally? It's like being handcuffed to a corpse.
There's a certain amount of truth in that, I guess. Although, I feel like if they could have survived a little longer, and especially if the nationalist juice had sort of waned a bit, the new emperor they got in 1916 was somewhat reform-minded, and it's possible that they could have ridden out the pressure and survived in some way.
Yeah, Karl was also a bit more had a bit more foresight in some cases. He famously was very much opposed to the Germans sending a bunch of radicals back into Russia, such as Lenin.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good on Karl. Good on Karl. Yeah, I mean, Austria-Hungary. I ultimately think that they're probably their biggest problem militarily, outside of logistics and the fact that they're going to have a bad infrastructure, especially as you have the blockade and the food shortages, but just really poor commanders on the upper level, especially Hotzendorf. That Carpathian Mountain counteroffensive, I can't help but think that if the Austrians just backed off, spent that time licking their wounds, replenishing their forces, they would have been in a much better position for the rest of the war.
Yeah.
Instead of hurtling men in a winter offensive through the mountains wearing cardboard shoes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we got any other ones, or is that the last one we got for now?
That's it for now. Although there was an interesting suggestion for a future stream of either rogue intelligence agencies or wacky directors of the FBI or CIA.
That could be pretty good. That one's definitely more out of my wheelhouse, though. Although I can kind of talk about German intelligence services in World War II and just how incompetent they were in many cases.
Yeah.
But anyway, so you want to move on to the Ottoman Empire?
Sure. Let's move on to the sublime port of Istanbul.
Yes, the sick man of Europe that was terminally sick for God, like a long time. If anything, the Ottoman Empire shows a lot more staying power than people gave it credit for. Even in this war, honestly, I think the Ottoman army kind of overperformed in many
Yeah,
cases. But
especially if you consider that the Ottoman military was not frequently victorious after they failed to take Vienna in 1683. So their second great drive on Vienna. From that point forward, the empire is pretty much in decline across the board, but especially militarily. Earlier, I mentioned that the Janissaries had become a burden on the state, and that would really start especially after 1683. So they went from being one of the most feared armies in Europe to just being a millstone around the neck of the empire. So one of the sultans had to purge them in 1826. And then after that, things got a little better in terms of the military being allowed to modernize, but still they were massively behind. Other countries were beginning to industrialize. The Ottomans were quite a bit behind on that. And mostly they kept all their territory due to diplomacy and the calculations of nations such as Britain, who thought that it was better for the Ottomans to keep their territories than for those territories to fall to their rivals.
particularly Russia.
Yeah, so basically the Ottomans are playing the politics of weakness, and they're doing it pretty damn well, actually. So
They are also the Turks. They lost most of their battles and wars after 1683, of course, but occasionally they could pull off something. One famous example was Peter the Great launched an invasion of the Ottoman Empire that was a complete fiasco, for instance.
yeah, I mean, and the thing is, while their army wasn't great, it was still effective enough that if you overreached, you would pay the price.
Yeah,
So
because
it's
they still had very good. They still had, through the age of horse and musket at least, they had very good light troops, and they were still very good engineers.
Yeah, and they
So
also had numbers, which helps a lot. So they had some
yeah,
things going for them. They weren't helpless, but at the same time, their ability to pull off anything particularly impressive was very limited. So all things being equal, they'd probably lose. But if you do something dumb, you'll pay the price.
yeah, and I remember Napoleon took them on and lost. Remember that too, right?
Yeah.
Remember, what was it? Got the butcher beat him. Remember?
Oh yeah. No, I mean,
He
yeah.
seemed
Actually, it's interesting. Every time we've ever played a board game in the Napoleonic era, or even the Protestant Reformation era, the Ottomans always take Rome. Every game. Without
yeah.
exception. Like I don't remember playing one of those games where the Ottomans didn't somehow take Rome, and it made no difference who was playing who.
Hey, a Turk can dream, right?
Yeah. So,
So,
all right.
the Empire going into this war. What about it?
Well, one of the most important things to remember is that whenever you have an absolute monarchy, which is what the Ottoman Empire was until 1909, the whims of your ruler are basically policy. And the last really empowered emperor was Abdul Hamid II, who ruled between 1876 and 1909. In 1878, a couple years into his reign, he abandoned an experiment to have a parliament because he was trying to modernize, and eventually he got a parliament together, decided that it sucked, and disbanded it. And then
As one does.
yeah, and then that same year, so this is when he starts to turn eastward. So he's looking to modernize, but in his own specific way, but he never quite figures out what that is. So he wants to modernize but not be Western. And that's not something that he's ever able to figure out. And you also have a group called the Young Ottomans, who are basically just saying we need to modernize, period. And he has a lot of conflicts with them. But in 1878, at the Berlin Congress, one of the items on the agenda was about Ottoman debt. And so now he's under a lot of international pressure to pay off the debts that his empire has incurred. So he sets up what is known as the Council on the Public Debt in 1881. And this agency will effectively control the empire's finances and spending priorities right up until the beginning of the war. And while they are taking massive chunks of imperial revenue to pay off the debt, including the revenue they're getting from lots of different western parts of the empire. At the same time, they are using some of that money to invest in telegraphs and railroads. So the Ottomans actually are modernizing during this period in terms of their infrastructure and industry. They're not stagnant. They're also getting a lot of foreign investment through this council, and while a lot of the foreign businessmen are making bank on this, the locals are also benefiting, and prosperity is actually increasing some, and you're also seeing job growth. So actually, within the Ottoman Empire, things are not terrible. At least not for the Turks and the more European
Also, the
sections.
Germans and the Austrians are investing, aren't they?
Yes. So this is also the period, and it's largely due to Abdul Hamid's personal preferences. He does not trust Lord Gladstone, the Prime Minister of Britain. They both think of each other as pure shit. So Abdul Hamid was deeply distressed when Gladstone was reelected in the late 1880s. And this, in part, is why he starts to embrace Germany more. Although early on he was also trying to embrace Russia. But of course that doesn't quite pan out. But over time he becomes closer and closer with Germany. He thinks that they are the least likely to screw him over, I guess because of geography mostly. He also gets a strange offer at one point from the early Zionist movement, where they offer to pay off the majority of his national debt in exchange for Palestine. He turns them down, but that would have been an interesting development if he had accepted.
Gotcha.
So
why did he turn him down?
I imagine because he doesn't want to give up territory. I mean, the guy's trying to keep his empire together. He believes that it's his realm. And he's also a fascinating personality. This is a guy who was simultaneously someone with a backbone of steel, but also who could really prevaricate at times and show weakness. So he's very wishy-washy at times, has resolve other times, and he's also a very dedicated poet who has about 13 wives. So he might have spent time on a boat drinking and having women over while writing poetry. In fact, he definitely did. I don't know if there was the boat, though, but everything else was in place. So, lived an interesting life.
Did he ever go to San Francisco?
Not to the best of my knowledge, although he might have actually fit in. I don't know. Another thing he actually pulled off with German and Austrian assistance is, despite initially coming in as someone who denounced university education, he then went on after the early 1880s to invest heavily in primary schools throughout the empire. So, fascinating guy. The point is that the Ottomans had made strides from about 1880 forward. In 1909, he's deposed by the young Ottomans, and they put his brother in charge, but his brother is much, much weaker. He's not an absolute monarch. And as for Abdul Hamid, he will only die in early 1918, so he lives to see the empire that he once ruled crumble around him. And also, his first initial place of exile was Thessalonica, which of course fell to the Greeks in 1912, so then he had to be relocated to Istanbul. Also, another thing to keep in mind, part of the reason why he turned to Germany was that in his negotiations with Britain, he bungled some, and he could have gotten a better deal from them had he been more flexible, but ultimately he pissed them off and they more or less took Egypt away without a fight. The Ottomans had had a lot of trouble controlling Egypt throughout the 19th century, and I forget exactly how this broke down, but he had an opportunity to reclaim it, and instead he pissed off the British somehow and they just took it. So, fascinating guy. Ultimately, after he left office, the pro-German policy really intensified, both because Wilhelm II foresaw some openings there. He thought that there was a lot of potential to get the Ottomans as allies, and the new leadership of the Ottoman Empire felt the same way. So this is when you have Lyman von Sanders and a bunch of German and Austrian advisors showing up in Istanbul to train the army. So the army does make some strides in the last few years right before the war, and in 1915 they're finally compelled by their allies to join the war effort. They're not really ready for it. And another thing that they have going against them that I have not mentioned up to this point is that if you look at their eastern areas, especially the Arab areas, those areas are also experiencing their own nationalist movements. So in places like Iraq, where there's an Arab majority, people do not want to be ruled over by the Turks. So when the British arrive and start winning battles, the people there are not exactly pining for the Sultan. They're just welcoming the British and moving on with their lives.
Okay.
And of course, their greatest hero of the war was Kemal Ataturk, who was both
Yeah.
the victor at Gallipoli and held back Allenby from crossing the frontier into Turkey.
Yes, Ataturk was very, very effective in this war.
To the point where he literally became the father of a nation.
Yeah. Although his legacy is being disputed heavily right now.
Yeah, it is. I don't think the current leader is a big fan of Ataturk, if I'm not mistaken.
No, he's not. He's not. But um, there was interesting thing about that. Ataturk's still popular in the cities, but he's not popular in the countryside. That's what I've heard, at least. But anyway, I don't want to get into that. That's contemporary stuff. We're gonna shy away from that for now. Let's stay in 1914, huh?
Okay.
Yeah, no. So the Turks are brought into this war. They, of course, are victorious at Gallipoli. They managed to halt, although their own attack across Sinai is a bloody disaster. They hold back an initial British offensive in the Egyptian area, if I'm not mistaken. There's also the British disaster at Baghdad. Probably one of Turkey's worst things, though, was the offensive that they had against the Russians in 1915. That was pretty much a bloody disaster, if you will. But I don't know. The Turks seem to have done better than most people expected going into this war. Anyway, you got any other thoughts on Turkey?
Um, Not really. I mean, I guess in terms of armaments, from what I understand, they were actually pretty close to being on par, or at least way closer than they should have been given their industrial capacity and their general reputation.
Yeah.
But, of course, in terms of actual performance, especially in their eastern armies, it didn't really pan out for them. So. And other
No,
than
did not.
Ataturk, I'm not really sure if they had any other successful commanders.
None that we can think of right now. They're particularly famous. I'm sure there might be some in the chat. There might be some Turkish World War One expert who will tell us about a division commander who really knew how to kick ass. Which I'm
Yeah.
sure there were. But no, the Ataturk's name one, main one that I can think of.
Yep. We had one
Right.
more super chat in the intervening time. I guess we can take care of that and then move on to our next
Then-
belligerent.
Oh, Ventura again. Best
Yep.
Central Power General, best Allied General. What
He
you think?
suggests Ludendorff and Monash.
Monash is very good. Ludendorff had his strengths, but I could never say best because he was really the guy who oversaw the 1918 not counter, but 1918 offensives in the West, in France. And the problem with those offensives is they were not done with any strategic framework. He was attacking areas to see what they could do. Like, attack here, cause some casualties, and we'll just see what happens. Almost as if they thought if they just made a few attacks in the Western Allies, they would suddenly just crumble right then and there. And that's just not the case. And so I feel like the 1918 offensives, the whatever momentum the Germans could have had in 1918, with the fact that they were shipping soldiers from the Eastern Front over, so they had more men coming in, and they had the better assault tactics at that moment, I think got wasted by Ludendorff's just not having a strategic vision of what those attacks were supposed to do. Are you
Right.
supposed to drive to the sea? Go to Paris? Maybe try to I don't know, encircle a salient or something. He just didn't. He just didn't have a strategic plan, so I can't go with Lotendorf. Um, I don't know. I mean, Kemal Ataturk is pretty good for the Central Powers.
Yeah,
Uh, there's uh, there's von Bolo, who was one of their best. One of one of their best overall commanders.
the
I wouldn't.
Croatian guy.
What'd you say?
Yeah, Croatian guy for the Austro-Hungarians.
Yes, yes. As far as the Allied generals go, you've got some contenders there. Monash was a great choice. I'm actually going with Brusilov for the Allies, though.
Was he the guy who invented assault tactics?
Not quite, but he modified the trench tactics for the situation he was in, and plus his own observations um, of what was going wrong. So the Russians were using like shorter, sharper bombardments and some specialized combat teams, if you will. And keep this in mind: the Germans had already done some similar stuff in Verdun in the initial attacks, so this wasn't like revolutionary, but he was able to bust open the Austro-Hungarian lines. The thing about the Brusilov offensive is that it's been called an offensive that essentially doomed two monarchies because for the Austro-Hungarians, the losses were horrendous and they never recovered from that one. Right, like whatever recovery they were getting at that moment's gone then. But at the same time, the Russians did take heavy, heavy casualties. The offensive was called off, and the fact that it did not, in the end, lead to a complete collapse of Austria-Hungary led to a serious dip in Russian morale. Well, at the same time, other Russians are like, wait, why did we call off this offensive that was working? So the fact that the Brusilov offensive did not quite achieve the goals that was set out for it um, undermined the Russian war effort. Brusilov himself is a fantastic commander. But you get some other ones. Patan. Patan is for me. It's either probably Patan or Brusilov. Actually,
Yeah, those seem like good choices. Trying to think. Yeah, I would probably go with Ataturk for the Central Powers, and then Brusilov for the Allies or Entente.
another good one for the Entente. Arthur Curry, very
Oh,
good as well.
not familiar with
Yeah,
him.
the Commonwealth, the Australians and the Canadians. They I think they had better commanders than the mainline British. You know.
Yeah, but then again, I don't know if the mainline British had any particularly good commanders.
Yeah. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I will admit it's been a while since I read about British commanders in the First World War.
Yeah, I know
They
the
definitely had some talented men. Oh, Allenby. Allenby was very good.
right. He liberated Palestine and drove up all the way to about Antioch.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Played superbly by Jack Hawkins in Lawrence of Arabia. Oh no, screw it. The best Allied general is Colonel Lawrence, right?
yeah, T. E. Lawrence or Blackjack Pershing.
Pershing was good.
Yeah.
Also Pershing was told, keep the American army separate. He made sure the American army was well trained, and I have to say, I'm actually a little more. I'm kind of more impressed with the American army in the Western Front of World War One than I am with them in the Western Front of World War Two. Honestly,
Huh.
well, because I mean, granted, they're fighting the closing months of the war. The German war effort's starting to break down. But if you look at it, the Americans are being thrown right into the meat grinder. Major offense of the Meuse Argonne. They do exceptionally well. They prove to be fast learners. The Allies become rather impressed with them. So yeah, I think the Americans in World War One, while their contribution to winning the war, I wouldn't call them decisive at all. They were important, but not decisive. But their armies impressed everyone, is what I'm saying.
Hmm.
So
I didn't realize
there you
that.
go. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying they didn't have their faults or their hiccups, but they learned their lessons fast and well in the First World War.
Australia is an idea, and ideas are bulletproof, except in Gallipoli. according to someone in our chat.
Ask Mel Gibson that. He was in the movie Gallipoli. Really good movie, by the way. Danny made a joke though because in the force that landed at Gallipoli was the MEF, the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. So Danny today called it the Mel Gibson Expeditionary Force.
I mean, if everybody had been the same as Mel Gibson was in, say, The Patriot, though, that would have been a short campaign, and the Allies would have taken Istanbul.
Look, as Cartman said, if the road warrior says it, it must be true.
Yeah, that's a fact.
That is a fact, man. So, do you want to go on to the Entente now?
Sure, let's move into the Entente.
All right. We got France, Britain, Russia, Serbia,
Italy and the
U.S.,
U.S.
Italy. Yeah. So I'll let you start the festivities. Who would you like to discuss first?
Let's get Serbia out of the way, I guess.
Yeah. In that case, we should do Russia next too, since they're very much connected. Uh, Serbia is fascinating going to this war because you're talking about a very underdeveloped country. I think I read somewhere there were like less than 100 doctors in the whole country or something ridiculous. I
Mm.
mean, that might be an exaggeration, but let's just say it's pretty backwards. Serbia also had a horrible reputation in the rest of Europe. They were kind of seen as a nation of like pirates, bandits, and assassins, essentially. So when the murder of Franz Ferdinand happens, opinion in Europe is anti-Serb, and that's partially how Austria-Hungary can make the kind of demands it does on Serbia. So make no mistake about it, the other allied countries are not fighting to defend Serbia, all right? Except maybe the Russians, right? Because the Russians have seen their influence and credibility diminish within in the 10 years leading up to the war. So their need to prop up Serbia, and Russia's pretty much Serbia's only ally for the most part, is one of the things that's going to lead them into the war. At any rate, Serbia, despite being backward, their soldiers are tough fighters. They do not want the Austrians there, so the initial Austrian offensives into Serbia are complete fucking disasters. All right? And Serbia is not going to collapse until the Austrians, the Germans send a few divisions there, and then the Bulgarians join in and attack their flank. Then that takes care of Serbia. But of course, some Serb soldiers fall back to Salonika and will play a part in the Vardar offensive, a very underrated offensive. But that's the offensive in the area of Greece that knocks Bulgaria out of the war, which in turn knocks Turkey out of the war, which then leads to a chain reaction that knocks Austria out of the war.
Huh.
So at any rate, yeah. So Serbia is important, for World War I starting, of course, because the Black Hand, the ones who killed Franz Ferdinand, had the backing of elements of the Serbian government. And also, one could say, well, Serbia should have given in to Austria in that last demand. But all I got to say to that is, they gave in to all the other demands. I mean, isn't that enough? Right?
Well, you'd think, especially since even though the Black Can may have had some ties with the government, they weren't exactly a branch of the government. So there's only so much you can ask from a government that is basically apologizing for a terrorist group associated with their nation.
Yeah, it should also be noted that in the case of Serbia as well, for them to have, they of course, I mean, they were already being humiliated, but I think to go that extra mile would have been too much. But like I said, Austria-Hungary is looking for a fight. They're looking for an excuse to go to war. At any rate, that's just a few thoughts I have on Serbia. You got anything?
Not really. Actually, of all the powers we'll be discussing, I think I know the least about Serbia.
Yeah, they were important country to it, but yeah, of course, like I was telling you, of the minor powers of this war, they're the most important of the minors. They also suffer horrendous losses. Almost 300,000 Serbians will die in the war. That's quite a bit, considering.
Yeah, it is. I don't think they had a very large population to begin with.
They did not. Like I said, economically backwards as well. Oh, also, I love the name of their national anthem at this time, God of Justice. Because remember, everybody, God is a Serb.
Of course.
Always remember, God is a Serb.
And I want to say in the First and Second Balkan Wars, the Serbs were involved. Let's see.
Oh yeah, most certainly.
I need to double check real fast. So the belligerents, yeah, they were in the Balkan League against the Ottomans, and they were on the winning side in the First War. And I believe, let's see, Second War. Yep, they were in that one too as one of the belligerents, and they were on the winning side against the Bulgarians. So, yeah, they had just fought 2 wars in a row prior to the outbreak of World War One. So they had been
Yeah.
at war for 2 years already, effectively, by the time that 1914 rolls around.
But yeah, no, Serbia, international pariahs at this time. Uh, so that's one of the reasons why Austria can put those kind of demands on them. And make no mistake about it, a rallying cry for the British will, of course, be Belgium. Serbia is a rallying cry for nobody. But hey, now they're your allies, right?
Well, technically for Russia, because
Technically for
Russia
True,
claimed
yeah.
to be the leader of the Slavic peoples, and the Serbs were one of the more prominent Slavic peoples at this time, at least in the news. Although, interestingly enough, apparently, despite all of the Russian propaganda about how they were the leader of the Slavic peoples, a lot of the common Russians didn't really give a shit about that.
So you tell me that the common Russians didn't care about Pan-Slavism?
It doesn't appear so.
Well, anyway, you want to get into Russia now?
Sure, let's move over to the steppe. So, Russia is another country which was pretty complicated internally, and that would manifest itself into how it performed during the war. So, on the surface, Russia was fairly politically stable. The Tsar, Nicholas II, was a member of the Romanov family, which dated back quite a ways. Was it 17th century or something like that? So yeah, pretty well heeled. Well connected with the rest of the European monarchies. As we mentioned earlier, Nicholas and Wilhelm II and George V were all cousins. The problem is that Nicholas II had a lot of power, and he was not necessarily the brightest guy in any room. He may have intended well. I know he's got a lot of supporters and admirers. A lot of people say he was a good man, this, that, the other. But he has a number of problems. He's not a very good judge of character. He does not really seem to understand the modern world. And his politics of sort of reactionary autocratic rule are pretty much irrelevant for a 20th century context. Their pressures for reforms. Oh, go ahead.
He's not reform minded enough, arguably, but at the same time he's not autocratic enough either. If you get my drift.
Yes, I think it's where his ideal was autocratic, but his personality was more lenient. So there was sort of an internal divide, and he wasn't going to go and do a full crackdown with secret police to really maintain order, but at the same time, he's not going to allow more openness. So he's kind of in a limbo. And this is exacerbated by the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, where the Russians are thoroughly humiliated by the Japanese. And this really shows that Russia is maybe not as militarily efficient as people thought. So his diplomatic standing after the Russo-Japanese War is in the toilet. A lot of his former allies, or people who might have been prospective allies, because actually there was an effort by Nicholas and Wilhelm prior to the Russo-Japanese War to make an alliance between Germany and Russia, and after that, Wilhelm's advisors say, fuck that. That is not worth it. So that goes out the window immediately. And also he gets disrespected after the Russo-Japanese War in a number of ways, one of which is that he was trying to prevent Austria-Hungary from annexing Bosnia in 1908. And so they created a deal where the Russians would allow the annexation to go down without a protest, so long as the Austrians allowed them to put some ships through the straits. So, presumably into the Adriatic. Russia was looking for more trade routes and more naval presence. And then, after the Austrians had annexed Bosnia, they said, you know what? I'm not really feeling the deal anymore. No ships for you. And then Britain intervened, Russia's supposed ally, and said, we agree with Austria. And then Nicholas had to just swallow it. Couldn't do anything.
Oh my. Oh God! What a bunch of assholes.
Yeah, so this was the politics of the era, and Nicholas's standing was not great internationally. At home, after the Russo-Japanese War, he gave in to the calls for demands for reform by forming a Duma. The first Duma was a complete catastrophe because almost everybody elected to it, probably 3/4, were people who said the government is incompetent and needs to be reformed. So there were a lot of people who were members of a party called Cadet, which was sort of a center-left party, but one that was willing to work with the government. You also had a strong left, which wanted to, institute a different form of government. You had a somewhat sizable center-right. The only people who were hardcore supporters of the monarchy were the far-right, and while they did have some vocal people, it wasn't a huge majority. So that was embarrassing for Nicholas, so he dissolved that Duma after 1 year rather than letting it serve out 5, which was his full term. Then he created the second Duma after he basically eliminated all the people who voted against him. So now you had a very small left, and Cadet was basically eliminated. And he did this by disenfranchising a lot of workers in industrial areas, and also by disenfranchising ethnic minorities. And then he created a Duma that was more pliable, but even so, they were slightly critical, and they didn't really work that well with the Tsar because he wasn't really looking to do that much reform. So it was kind of a sham to try to make it look like he was modernizing without actually doing anything. A sop, really.
Yeah.
So that's the state of the internal affairs. And underlying all of that, if you look back at the first Duma of 1906, which had this huge opposition wing, this really shows you that there is a ton of tension, and that calls for either severe reform, which would mean ending the monarchy or taking away its power, or instituting a more radical form of government, whether it's democracy or some sort of socialist setup. All of those kinds of movements are gaining steam, and gaining steam rapidly. And also uniquely, unlike most of the other countries, the intelligentsia of Russia was very much a part of the working class. A lot of people who had high educations were very poor. In most of the other countries, most of the scholars were gentlemen scholars. They were men who had estates, men who were wealthy, who were fundamentally conservative and wanted to maintain the status quo.
Oh, you've heard that theory that's been bandied about lately about elite overproduction?
No.
It's the idea that one of the precursors to revolutions is when you have a lot of people who are trained to be in the elite, or at least like in management or whatnot, and there's not enough positions for them. So essentially you have a bunch of educated people who believe that they deserve more.
Yes, that's one explanation I heard for the Arab Spring, actually.
Yeah, it's one of the theories of revolution that I agree with for the most part. It's not true in all cases, of course, but I've seen it for a lot of them. You know,
Yeah.
diminishing expectation. There's a whole thing about like the expectations are what opportunities there are not enough to meet the expectations, even if the opportunities are gradually rising. So yeah, that's an explanation for the Arab Spring, for the troubles in Ireland that happened around this time as well. So yeah, it's a pretty good theory, and it seems like the same thing holds true with Russia here as well.
Yeah. So militarily, Russia apparently had a decent enough army in most regards in terms of training. I mean, maybe not on the German level, but if you look at what happens in the war, they do well against most of their other opponents. the problem that they had was logistics, even more so than the industry itself, just getting stuff from where it was made to where it needed to be. And a lot of
Yeah.
this is just that there's a lot of empty space between Russia and the battlefront, and especially the industrial heartland near Moscow. So it got to the point where in 1915, at one point, when new men were being deployed to the front, about 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of them was unarmed, and they were told to find weapons when they got to the front and take guns off of dead bodies, basically.
They also started to have major ammunition shortages in 1915.
Yeah, so I mean, the fact that the Russian armies won more battles than they lost under those conditions is pretty impressive. And of course, famously, the Tsar took personal command at one point. And
Yes.
he did this against the advice of 10 out of his 12 senior advisors because it
Well,
was a
he had
big
this,
gamble.
well, he had this thought that he had this thought, of course, that his personal presence would inspire the soldiers. And to be somewhat fair to the Tsar, when he would have experiences with soldiers and sailors, he was still being treated with a kind of reverence, if you will, which is very well depicted in the TV show Fall of Eagles. And there's also a cut scene from the movie Nicholas and Alexandra, which is an excellent film. I recommend seeing, where they have like those Russian soldiers. They like, they're going to the front, and the Tsar is like giving them cards that he's blessed, right? And
Yeah.
they're falling at his feet. And of course, I mean, a lot of Russians at this time, of course, are like, oh, Tsar Schmar, he's an asshole. But he did see enough devotion in him for him to think that his personal leadership would be inspiring. The way it must have been for Tsar Alexander the First, right, when he was riding around taking on Napoleon.
Yeah. And I mean, there was still a lot of goodwill toward the Tsar, even among some people who were fed up with the government, because there was that sort of idea that the Tsar was pure of heart and was the little father who was looking out for all of them. But his advisors might be corrupt or incompetent, and they were the problem. If only the Tsar could manifest his will without the intervention of other people, then everything would be great.
We saw the same thing, of course. Just I'll been just contemporary thing. We saw a similar thing with Trump, and to a lesser degree Obama.
Yes, we did.
People like they have the king is good, but it's those pesky advisors. If only he knew what they're really up to, and he got rid of them, right?
Yeah.
Which I guess has been true a few times, maybe in history.
But for the most part, people kind of know what their advisors are up to, at least in most cases, unless they are children or something of that nature. But yeah, in the case of Nicholas, he did know what his advisors were up to, and he deliberately chose some of the people around him, including Rasputin, who was an advisor to his wife, a spiritual advisor, a man who was illiterate, and who spent most of his time drinking and whoring. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that does not qualify you to run a country.
It does not qualify you also to be a Eastern Orthodox mystic, right?
Right, exactly. So you have the country being run in Nicholas's absence largely by Tsarina Alexandra and her close advisor, Rasputin. Of course, Rasputin then gets assassinated by a combination of two imperial aristocrats, so two relatives of the Romanovs, and some far-right guy who decide that for the interest of the country they have to take out Rasputin. And that happens in late 1916. Of course, that assassination attempt is comical because Rasputin is basically unkillable, or pretty damn close to it.
Well, it's those satanic powers, right?
Yeah, because what is it? They beat the shit out of him, shot him, everything else, and then threw him in a river, and they had his hands bound, but when they found him, he had managed to get one of his hands free, and I think he only died because of either the cold or drowning. The wounds they'd inflicted on him did not kill him.
My father had a rubber stamp of Rasputin, like for ink, like you put an ink pad and you stamp it on something, and it was Rasputin in a pool of water, naked, shaking his fist defiantly.
It's pretty great.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool too. But no, no the Russian government, of course, is messed up. Russian soldiers, of course, are natural. They're notoriously tough. Frederick the Great said you had to shoot them twice, and then after you go survey the wounded, shoot them again. I believe Napoleon said the thought of the Russian army during the Napoleonic Wars. He said like the best soldiers and the worst generals, and you can make the same case for this war as well. These soldiers they're tough, like you said, they do well against the Austrians and the Turks, but they have a lot of problems in the upper level. They have major problems with logistics, of course. But yeah, Russia is going into this war when their military has not modernized, the railroad system is not ready. Um, you could make an argument the same thing with Austria-Hungary counts for Russia. They're looking for a quick win. They're not there for the long haul.
Yeah, although I think it's possible that Nicholas was very much banking on his popularity with the people, and he maybe thought he had a little more time and stability than the Austrians did.
He might have, but at this point he has to intervene. He can't. I'm trying to say, like you said, like all the humiliations that have happened to him with Bosnia, with Russo-Japanese War, with the Balkan conflicts. I mean, if he doesn't intervene, what credibility does he have left? Right.
True.
So here we get it. We get an empire in crisis. That is get involved in a war because it feels that it has to. But there was this theory that a lot of these countries had, and you saw in Austria-Hungary as well. Hotzendorf thought this, that the act of war, the experience of war, could be used as a bonding agent for the nation. And as events will prove, that will not be the case for Russia, of course.
Of course.
Yeah. Anything else really to say about Russia in particular? I know their navy they had taken pounding in the Russo-Japanese War, which was very bad for their credibility and stature. And of course, another reason that their stature had fallen so much is that Russia had lost to Japan, which was this is the age of scientific racism, so they're considered an inferior race by most Europeans. Although, do you know how a lot of them wrote that off, though? By the way.
How's that?
They were saying Russians aren't even really that European anyway.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. That's why it's going to take Pearl Harbor and Singapore to really knock that one out, But anyway.
Although then other Europeans, especially the Germans who had their own race theory, they probably say, well, the Americans are really mongrels anyway. They're pretty mixed, so.
Yeah, I know the. What does it say though? No, so he has to, and I would not subscribe to the idea that Russia is the author of World War One. Russia is in the least enviable position of any of these countries, except maybe Serbia, right?
Yeah.
But at any rate, one thing should be said for Russia too. They launched their invasion of Germany prematurely, which led, of course, to the disaster at Tannenberg, which one thing that facilitated that was that the Russian code being used for transmissions was very simple, so the Germans easily ciphered it. But in launching that attack, they did draw German reserves away from the Western Front, which is really what they needed at that moment. Now, the degree to which that was decisive in determining Germany, the Schlieffen Plan failing, that's debatable, but it was always part of the Allied plan that the Russians would attack concurrently to draw troops away from the attack on France. And in that regard, Tannenberg was a success, at least. Yeah. Any other thoughts on Russia?
Not really.
Yeah, it's a military problem. So the Navy thing. What I want to conclude with that was that the Russian Navy won't be able to be too active in this one. They really weren't that great. They were also in the middle of modernizing. But I will say this: for my game on World War II at sea, I also included a lot of World War I ships that players could use if they wanted to. And I do have to say, a lot of the Russian ship designs that they were getting ready to make for their next generation were really good. So I think if the Russian Empire had survived somehow, they would have actually had a first-class navy, at least in terms of ship design.
That would be an interesting development.
Yeah, it could be fascinating.
Hmm.
Uh, so, leaving the Russians behind, do you want to do the big boys of France and Britain, or do you want to do the sidekicks, Italy and America?
Um, let's just get to Italy. Let's get to the best one of them all.
All right, man. So, what you got for Italy?
Well, obviously, as we discussed earlier, they were the most opportunistic entrant into the war. A lot of the other major powers, and I guess they qualify as a major power. Maybe they're sort of the least of the major powers, but I think they're big enough to count. Um,
Yeah, they're a
they,
major power.
yeah, they literally were shopping their options and doing so at what amounts to a public auction. So they're trying to see who is willing to pay them the most, the Entente or the Austro-Hungarians, in terms of land. So it's amazingly crass what they did diplomatically going into the war. That being said, I don't know a ton about Italy prior to the war, but I don't think they were terribly industrialized. That was a problem they never really rectified going into World War II. They had not really had a mass mobilization before this point. So while they had a lot of enthusiasm for the war, there wasn't a lot of talent in terms of people who had experience and training. Um, the areas they were planning on attacking were mountainous, so they were planning to fight on almost entirely defensible terrain. Whereas they could have negotiated and gotten those things for free. So Italy's entry into the war was incredibly stupid. They could have gotten everything they wanted, or at least a lot of it, for nothing. But instead, they paid a heavy price in blood and became politically destabilized and demoralized by everything that happened to them. I don't think they starved during the war though. I mean, Italy has some decent agriculture, especially when they control Sicily as well. So I guess they had that going for them. But aside from not starving, their armies really struggled despite the military genius of Luigi Cadorna.
Yeah, I'd probably say of all the countries in this war, none had a more woeful military record than Italy, except maybe the Austro-Hungarians, maybe. I mean, it's pretty bad. I mean, how many battles of the Isonzo can you launch?
I don't know, but I found a meme randomly. Uh, when your teacher thinks you're studying, but you're actually planning the 117th Battle of the Isonzo River.
I mean, the Italians, of course, did show market improvement in 1918. To be fair to them, uh, you were asking about Italy beforehand. Uh, in some ways, Italy had already done something pretty opportunistic pre World War One. That's when they took over Libya, and Libya at that time was a Turkish province, and that war was brief. But you know what it's known for in particular? Its claim to fame. Uh, it is the first war where aircraft were used, both for scouting and bombing.
Ah,
Yeah. So, at any rate, you think about that. That kind of goes in that theory I mentioned earlier that once the great powers had gobbled up all they could of Africa, they turned on each other. And one of the first, if you believe in that theory, and I'm sympathetic to it, you're kind of like your bleeding Kansas moment, if you will, your Boston massacre, your prelude to the war is Italy going after Libya to opportunistically peel off a detached province from the Ottoman Empire. Um, anyway, the Italians, I I know they started to have major breakdowns in morale, much like the French army had in 1917 as well. And Cadorna, the Italian army under his command, became notorious for its use of firing squads. I think they may have executed more of their own soldiers than any other country in this conflict. Apparently, Cadorna believed in the Roman concept of decimation.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that. I mean, I haven't done an in-depth dive on Cadorna, but yeah, I just see bits and pieces, and everything that I read just sounds immensely frustrating.
Yeah, and he sticks around too for way too long, much like Hotzendorf back in Austria.
I also
Um,
saw some joke somebody made about how Cadorna was so bad that he would have made Hotzendorf look like a genius.
between the two of them, it's a tough call, but I guess Hotzendorf has got the edge. But man, I mean, I think they're two of the worst ever. So just leave it at that. Uh, yeah, no, Italy very opportunistic. This I think you made a good point there. I didn't think about that. They could have gotten that land for free, but no, they had to like lose over 600,000 lives. And their betrayal of Austria-Hungary, like you pointed out earlier, meant that the Austro-Hungarians there fought harder, and it also helps when you actually have a competent general in charge as well. So yeah, Italy, this country really is a clusterfuck, but they do get a lot of what they want when the war is over, and it's I'd say as a country they're not quite as frustrated by the Treaty of Versailles. I just saw the video with the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty where they were talking about the fact that the Italians essentially got everything they wanted. Um, but still, the very heavy losses they incurred, and they got economic problems afterwards. And as we all know, very shortly after the war, the fascists will come to power with Mussolini and the March on Rome. Mussolini himself being a veteran of the Italian army at this time.
Yeah, and then he proceeded over the next nearly 20 years to prepare his country for war without making up for any of the problems that cost him in World War One. So he did a great job, and
They made up for some, and honestly, one thing I don't know as much about Italy in the First World War as I do World War II, but they did have, of course, individual elite units in World War One, like the Arditi and the Alpine units. Which the same problem you run into in World War II. Italian units are either like best of the best, or these guys are worthless. You
wow.
know, yeah, just the Italian. That's the problem. The Italian army of World War II. There's at least as far as my research shows, there's not really much in between. You know, so I think it might have been some similar cases in this war as well. But at any rate, do you want to move on to the U.S. of A.
Sure. USA.
More stuff.
USA.
How's it feel, everybody? That we're talking about a war where the Americans are the sidekicks.
Yeah, it's a nice retro throwback.
Yeah. I mean, like, we are definitely the sidekicks in this
And
conflict.
also where we skipped out on most of the fighting and just came in at the end to finish it off.
Yeah, just enough so we could be at the peace negotiations, which no doubt annoyed a lot of the people there. And I know that everybody hates Wilson now, right?
Pretty
Like, is
much. I
that
think
a,
on the YouTube history scene, he is basically Satan at this point.
yeah, right and left, right? Like, so, I mean, I don't know, like listen to some of those dissident right people. Oh my God, they fucking loathe Wilson. I think they hate Wilson more than any other U.S. president.
Well, he's safe to hate because the left won't defend him due to his record on race.
Yeah, I also think that because Wilson really got America involved in internationalism, and there's also the idea that the Federal Reserve was started under him. A variety of other progressive policies were inaugurated by Wilson.
And he was in
So he's
general a fairly big government guy, so between all those things, he's the perfect boogeyman for the right.
exactly, and so at any rate, uh, one idea that I hear amongst those people is that Wilson in 1916 ran on the platform of he kept us out of the war, and then he immediately got reelected and went right into the war. And they say it like it was some master plan. It wasn't. Woodrow Wilson did not want to go to war this time. So what happens? All right. So the war starts. Understand that America already was more economically tied to the British and culturally as well. That's even more so once the blockade is put into effect by Britain. That said, there's still a strong current of Anglophobia in America at this time. And then it also doesn't help that you have a lot of Irish. And the Irish are a vital part of the Democratic coalition at this time as well. And Wilson himself was not particularly, he definitely wasn't an Anglophile, that's for sure. So anyway, the Lusitania happens. American public opinion really turns hard against the Germans. However, the evidence shows that the British diplomats at that time overplayed their hand, and by 1916, Wilson would barely talk to them. He found them annoying. And in Britain, they were starting to conclude in 1916 that it may be impossible to get America into the war. So I believe Wilson is sincerely elected as a peace candidate in 1916. But then what happens? The Germans go for unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917. And the German gambit, of course, was that they would be able to destroy British commerce in short order. And understand something else, too. We think a lot about the U-boats in World War II, and they were very effective. But I got to say, the 1917 campaign, like the first 6-7 months of it, there's never been a submarine campaign more effective. I mean, they are sinking just about everything afloat at this point. But the idea was that if they sank all those ships, the British economy would collapse, and also by sinking that many ships, how could the Americans get over anyway? Well, the convoy system was eventually put in place, and then after that, U-boat sinkings went down, American reinforcements pour in, and we play an important role in the closing months of the war. But it's interesting that Wilson, who did not want to get involved in the conflict, was dragged in by unrestricted submarine warfare, plus the Zimmermann telegram didn't help either. And so there was a popular fervor against Germany.
I guess early in the war, too, another consideration is that there were a ton of German immigrants in the U.S.
Yeah. Although, the anti-German stuff that happened afterward once the war started, right?
Yeah, don't speak in front of the Hun.
Yeah, exactly. You had Germans getting jailed. I mean, people talked about Trump being against the press. I'm like, Trump ain't got nothing on Woodrow Wilson. I mean, this guy's going after anybody to consider press. And this is really one of your low points for civil liberties in America is the Wilson administration during the First World War. As far as the American military, when it enters the conflict, Navy is large, has good ship designs. It's welcomed, but by that time, the German high seas fleet is not really going to be able to challenge the Royal Navy anyway. The army was very, very small, had to be rapidly expanded, and it took some time to get it in there.
I think Wilson deliberately delayed deployment to make sure the men were better trained and equipped.
Yes, there were some delays in that case as well. The Americans were smart though. When they get over, the Americans, because of that Anglophobia, they didn't really play up we're coming to help the British, right? They played up we're coming to help the French. Like, Lafayette we have returned. A lot of the posters would feature like Joan of Arc and stuff. And when they get over there, of course the Americans work with the British, but it's really the French they work with more than anything else. And they even use French equipment. I mean, most of the aircraft we're going to use in World War I is French aircraft. So they really played that up at the time, and that was a way to sidestep some of the Anglophobia that was still popular in America, and especially amongst the Irish.
I guess to be fair, too, the French were more spent than the British.
The French are the ones that actually have the part of their country occupied. And once again, like this whole we're repaying the French finally for the American Revolution. So anyway, the French worked pretty closely with the Americans, and the Americans, I mean, once they get over, they do have a good system for getting combat experience. Their divisions get in there and get some action. Other ones were deployed to quiet sectors to learn their stuff. So yeah, the American military, considering that it has to, I mean, of course we have the industrial base for it, but considering how underprepared the army was, we do pretty damn well, I would say.
Yeah, I want to say that because of Wilson making the extra preparations, that American units were better equipped than most of their opponents and also most of the Allied contingents in terms of having machine guns, mortars, and all of the other pieces of equipment you would want.
Yeah.
And also tanks. Apparently, once tanks and aircraft became standard, he said, "All right, before we go in, we're going to make sure we have the standard number of tanks and aircraft that you're supposed to have." Which, the more
Yeah,
I think about it, the
America.
more I think that maybe his demands about all of those things and his rejection of the idea that the Americans should just be plugged into the front line willy nilly had a lot to do with the fact that he still wasn't super into the war. And he was kind of pissed off that he gotten dragged into it.
It could have been partially it, but I think he wanted it to be known that the Americans were an independent force that had achieved their battlefield success on their own. Now, keep in mind, though, in the crisis of 1918, the Germans are breaking lines in the trenches. Yeah, American units are being plugged in willy nilly at that time, and of course, will do well, most famously at Belleau Wood. Um, but yeah, no. So that's America's situation going into the conflict. Um, the degree to which America leaves the war stronger is debatable. Uh, plenty of Americans will see the involvement as a mistake, and isolationism will come back in strong force afterwards. But anyway, you want to go move on? I want to do some quick super chats before we get to the two big boys.
Sure, let's see what we got here. We have one from Nathan Center, which was $4.99. He doesn't leave a comment, but thank you. And then we'll
Also,
have...
does it CS Ventura $10? Thank you. Do you think that World War One was an inevitability after the Industrial Revolution, or was it unnecessary? Also, was monarchy doomed after the Industrial Revolution, or was it World War One that destroyed it? Man, there's a lot of questions and some good ones. You got any thoughts?
I'm not sure. That's a good question, though. I do think that the Industrial Revolution very much changed the relationship between the common person and their way of making money. So it definitely, by forcing people off their land and into cities, it sort of broke the traditional sort of what you might call feudal hierarchy that kind of supported monarchy. The idea of you have a stricter system in place of, your king, your aristocracy, common people. Although that had kind of been the case for a long time, ever since even the late Middle Ages, where you have cities that are kind of outside of the feudal structure. So I guess the question is, can monarchy survive without traditional aristocracy? And I don't know.
I mean, there was an attempt to, of course, fuse it with a sense of nationalism. One that I think is interesting about the Industrial Revolution is that, in one regard, it definitely hurts monarchies. Is that by making it work in factories, you're clustering them together. But being clustered together, it's easier for them to have common interests and also for them to organize.
Yeah.
There's actually a somewhat similar thing in if you look at the Russian and German revolutions in the First World War. A lot of them start with naval rebellions. So that makes sense, though. You have a bunch of guys who have to hang out in a boat together, right? You're going to be, I mean, that's an easy way to organize some people. And, that's why the other argument goes that once work in America became more atomized, that's one of the things that works against having a workers' movement and consciousness in the country. But yeah, the Industrial Revolution, in that regard, I think did undermine monarchy. But World War One, of course, is death knell. I mean, the conflict's over. Three of the oldest and greatest of dynasties are gone: Hohenzollern, Habsburg, and Romanov. Right.
Right.
So I mean,
go ahead.
No, I don't know how long powerful monarchs could have gone on for, but the First World War definitely ended that, and that's why I hate to make I wouldn't call the World War One this completely pointless conflict, because an argument can be made that if you look at the countries that were in the best condition when the war was over, it was the more democratic ones. And, so a conflict like the First World War only reinforced those trends because those countries were victorious. I mean, Who knows? What if the Kaiser and his forces had seized Paris in 1914? Would we be having the same discussion, really?
Huh.
I mean, that would have been. I mean, not that Germany was some pure, autocracy, but I mean, the French Third Republic had a lot of problems. There were definitely conservative elements. I mean, hell, Pétain is going to lead a fascist French government a few decades after the war. What if the Germans do take Paris? It isn't like they didn't take Paris simply because they were fighting Democrats, right?
Right.
So, yeah, that's interesting. What if? But I think that's the main thing in World War One is that one of, in fact, actually up to that point, democracy's main competition had been monarchy, and it was dealt a death blow. But that said, what do we get during the war? We get the Russian Revolution, so now you have a new competitor with liberal democracy, if you will, communism, and then we're going to get fascism very shortly thereafter, too. You know?
Right.
But I still like what you said, that the real story of the 20th century is the conflict between capitalism and communism, and World War II is the side quest.
I stand by that, I think.
I've said it to a few people; they like it as well. I think it makes sense.
Speaking of that, actually, there was one super chat a while back that I wrote down and then forgot about, and that was also by C.S. Ventura for $5. And he asked us, he said, "Thanks again for the World War I talk. Why do you think this war is so under-discussed despite having just as much, if not more, influence on modern day as World War II?"
There's a lot to that one. You got any thoughts?
Well, I think a lot of it is that the U.S. was much more involved in World War II than one. And also, when we got involved in global affairs, that time it became permanent. So I think that had a lot to do with it. That, and we really regarded World War II as this glorious victory over a manifest evil force. So
yes, that's a big one.
That, combined with the technology of the time, movie theaters were pretty universal by the 1940s. Then by the 50s, you have television, and one of the key demos are The Greatest Generation. So you're talking about their experiences. So now all of this becomes something that people want to popularize and talk about as much as possible. And it remains popular because you have a huge veteran community. Not to say there weren't a lot of World War I veterans, but there were fewer than there were of World War II veterans. And as TV becomes more and more popular, the World War I age demo is dying out, but the World War II demo will be around for decades. So they're trying to appease that demographic, but also appeal to their kids who are interested about what their parents did. So World War II has remained extremely popular, largely for cultural reasons. People are interested in that part of our history, and compared with a lot of things that came after it, this was some of the best work America did on the global stage, helping to fight Imperial Japan and Nazism. So what's there not to like about it? It's a great story.
I think another one too is just how the World War I was portrayed. Now, not every participant felt this way. Many felt that their sacrifice was worth it, and others downright liked it, being in the trenches. But there did develop this idea that this was this horrible, tragic, needless war in which men were slaughtered in these trenches that barely moved. And the sheer horror of that, I think, maybe not as much for some common soldiers, because I think there's a lot of evidence, especially with the British, that that they saw it as worth it, what they did. But a lot of your intelligentsia who went into that war gladly are going to leave it bitterly disillusioned. And also just the destruction of I don't know. It's like the futile tactics, the waste of life. Oh, the fact that these countries, when it's over, who's really in that great of a position? I mean, the British Empire reaches its largest extent in 1921, but very soon after it's beginning to unravel, and then they lose Ireland. And think about this. Before the British could do imperialism anywhere else, they did in Ireland first. So, the test run, if you will, from centuries ago, kicked them out. So Yeah, that was played a major role. So the countries leave World War One not feeling like they have accomplished much. I mean, you have the rise of fascism and communism in Russia and Italy. America goes isolationist anyway, and then there's the Red Scare, and the British Empire starts losing power almost right away. Uh, the French have suffered horrendous casualties, um, and what can we say? The French. In the case of the French, they suffered so much death to achieve what they did get in the war. Although I'd probably say of all the countries, probably France might have felt the most positive at the end, because they're like, hey, we got Alsace and Lorraine back, but we'll get to that in a sec, right? So I think there's a lot of these countries that feel bitterly disappointed within a few years the conflict ending as well. Whereas, man, I mean, like World War II's over, America's riding high, and in the case of Britain, while they did sacrifice a lot, they're still feeling that they had avoided a worse fate, a much worse fate. That's another big one too. Like you said, World War One doesn't have as much of a clear line of good versus evil, right?
Right.
I mean, the Germans probably are the worst, or one of the worst of these countries, considering some of the stuff they had done in Africa recently, and the fact that they had some pretty messed up plans for Russia, I must say. But all that being said, it's not quite as clear cut as World War II. World War II is like the comic book war in many ways for us. I mean, hell, how many comic book villains are based on Hitler?
All of them.
Crazy. Yeah, I mean, like a guy's like, I have an idea for world conquest. I'm kind of nutty, and I'm gonna make these super weapons to rule the world.
Yeah, I mean, that being said, too, the basic narrative of World War II is that it was a huge ideological clash, and then the side of democracy and capitalism won. And then, especially in the aftermath of World War II, it's the Cold War, where it's a big ideological clash, democracy and capitalism on the one side, communism on the other. So
Yeah,
the idea, I think, in many ways, is that it's proof that we can win a grand conflict of that kind. So it's reassuring.
yeah.
And then come out of it better than ever. Unlike World War
But
One,
there
where
is,
everybody came out of it looking like shit.
yeah, there is this severe cynicism that starts to creep in afterwards. And you really look at it too. There was an interesting essay I had to read that Hamilton gave us, where it was called "The New Deal is Great Exception." And let me explain what it means. The argument of it was that the 1920s was normal, the 30s and 40s were the weird time. But if you think about it, whereas the way things are in the 1920s, I mean, much of it is a product of the way technology's going and also prohibition in America. But another part of it too is a kind of cynicism and a lack of faith that has come due to the First World War, which means, hey, everybody, well, the world's screwed up. Let's just get drunk and nothing means anything. Suddenly those great tales of empire and heroism as written by Kipling, even though they still retain some popularity, um, they're no longer the center of where culture and art are going.
Yeah, I guess Empire sounds great as long as it's other people in distant lands doing it.
Oh man. So yeah, I think that's what happened. Is World War One destroyed a lot of confidence, and it just doesn't fit those cartoon archetypes.
I agree. We also had some by Nathan Center, and the first one that I didn't think had a message that actually did. It was just in a different message. He said, "Appreciate you and Sean's channel. Missed the first portion, but I'll catch the replay." Thank you, Nathan.
Oh, excellent.
And he followed that up by clarifying another Super Chat 4.99. He said, "Oops, just saying I appreciate your videos. You and Sean are great." Well, thank you, Nathan. And lastly, he sent one final one for 4.99, and he said, "Exactly, both sides in the Great War were culpable for it transpiring." So yeah, I think by this point we're already discussing why World War II was more covered than one. And yeah, if you look at World War One, it doesn't really it doesn't help anyone's argument if they're trying to argue about the present and trying to make their country look better at the expense of some other country. because no one really looks too great in this. Especially, Italy was on the quote good side, but their reasons for getting into the war are pretty embarrassing. And then their performance was also embarrassing. So neither of those things help. There's no reason anyone would glorify the Austro-Hungarian Empire because it disappeared. So, they're not going to be defenders of that. The Ottoman Empire, same thing. So I guess for the Turks, maybe they can celebrate the birth of their nation, but at the same time, their nation was the rump state of their empire. So, while they do celebrate Ataturk, they celebrate Ataturk's victory specifically, not the war.
Well, you can make a case though, man, that Turkey's really trying to do Ottoman Empire 2.0 right now in some ways. So I think there's people in Turkey who, of course, lamented that they lost their empire naturally.
Yeah.
But yeah, even France, having suffered the horrible losses they did, although France did get Alsace-Lorraine back. Do you want to go to France right now?
Yes, let's go to the land of people dressed in baby blue military uniforms, which I had never noticed until recently. And the reason I noticed it was I recently went with my girlfriend to a flea market where they have a lot of things on auction. And one of the things they had was a collection of World War I helmets, mostly French. And then I noticed that they were basically baby blue. So I guess up to that point I'd never actually seen pictures of French soldiers from the war up close. So I had no idea that was their color. So I don't know why that was such a big deal for me, but I did not have them pictured that way, so.
So, do you want to have anything comments you want to start off with France, or you want me to?
I'll let you start off.
Well, France goes into this war with a lot of baggage. All right. Up until the Franco-Prussian War, France was still considered your main European power. They then lose a war humiliatingly. And understand, of course, the French had lost wars before that, but not the way they did in 1871. And so the French then lose part of their territory, the Alsace-Lorraine region. And so a lot of the Third Republic is based on this idea that one day we're going to get back there and take the land back that is ours. And so the French military is geared towards getting that land back. And for that, France also realizes that they are no longer independently strong enough to take on Germany. Germany punches above, has much more men and can call much more manpower. So France this whole time is trying all of its ways to get allies, and eventually will succeed in getting both Britain and Russia on its side. Anyway, what's interesting about the French army is at the soul of French military history, dating back to Louis XIV, is a debate between two very dissimilar kinds of soldiers, which is, by the way, it's one of the reasons why I love French history, is that it's filled with these kind of extremes, if you will, right? Like a lot of our ideas of laissez-faire capitalism come from France, but so do socialist ideas as well. And anyway, in the French military, you essentially have had this debate between those who favor the attack, get them with the bayonet, right? And those who favor fortresses, defense. Well, the French military had only just right before the war adopted an attack-first mentality. And so the French believed that they could strike with elan. And maybe this isn't surprising. One of my favorite paintings of this era was, I think it was done by Delatour. I can't pronounce the name. Anyway, it's called The Dream. It's this beautiful painting, and you have these French soldiers who obviously they're on maneuvers and they're sleeping, and above them in the clouds is the dream they're all sleep. They're all the dream they're all dreaming. You know what it is?
Napoleon.
It's like that French Napoleonic revolutionary soldiers charging into battle. It's a beautiful work of art.
Yeah, I've seen that one. It is pretty interesting, and I think that it does capture sort of their self-perception pretty well.
Yeah, this is the dream. We're gonna reclaim our Napoleonic glory, and we're gonna get Alsace-Lorraine back. Another thing to keep in mind too, have you ever looked at a lot of Franco-Prussian French art? There's a lot of it. And it's interesting. They move towards soldiers because in your Napoleonic stuff, of course, they did some soldier stuff, but a lot of them just be Napoleon. Now, that said, even with Napoleon, there was always an effort to, not always, but there's often an effort to put soldiers in the painting, like Napoleon with the plague victims, right? Or one example is Napoleon at Yalao, which is one of the best Napoleonic paintings. What's interesting about it is he does show dead soldiers at the feet of Napoleon. Or Napoleon at Jena, where they show a member of the guard talking to him. So the French military art already made a point of showing soldiers, but the Franco-Prussian War, because they considered the generals to have failed them, but the soldiers had fought hard and heroically. A lot of the paintings are of like individual moments where French soldiers did well, or French soldiers like under pressure but holding their own. Almost nothing of French generals in that era. So yeah, there's a whole militarism to France, and all that said, this country is only getting involved in the war because the Russians are getting involved. And even then, France was a bit slow to mobilize because they were having some communication problems. If I'm not mistaken, I believe one of the French government officials, I think it was the president or prime minister, I forget which one, was leaving Russia at the time, and the Germans purposely jammed their radio transmissions.
Wow.
So at any rate, yeah, the French mobilized, they launched their attacks, they're bloody, horrible failures. French casualties are very heavy. Even into 1915, they're still very aggressive. And then you get Verdun and Petain was not necessarily a fortress guy, but he was definitely somebody who was more favorable to fortresses. And Petain definitely believed in firepower over Elan. Well, his success at Verdun prompts the French to then try what's called the Nivelle Offensive. That's a disaster and leads to a mutiny. You ever read about the French army mutiny?
A tiny bit.
1917. What's up?
I've read a tiny bit about it, but not that much.
Yeah, it's really fascinating because the people who led the mutiny, they made sure the Germans never knew. The Germans didn't know a mutiny was happening because the guys leading it were like, if the Germans find out, they'll attack and take advantage of it. They're doing this as a form of protest against having their lives thrown away in useless attacks. And in that regard, then Petain's in command. And in that regard, the mutiny, while a lot of the head mutineers are jailed, some of them are executed, the French do respond to that. And Petain improves training and to make sure the men build up confidence. Instead of like launching some grand offensive, he launches a series of small offensives through 1917 and 18 that are designed to build confidence and whittle away at the Germans. So anyway, the French military entered the war with an offensive doctrine that they had just adopted. There's an entire debate in the French military between even how to fight the war. Casualties, of course, will be horrible. I want to say almost equal to the Russians in terms of death. No, I mean, not too far off. But yeah, the French lose the third most people in this conflict. And that definitely scars them, those heavy losses.
But yeah, going into World War II, their demographics were completely boned. So starting in 1936, the new incoming classes of men were half the size that they should have been.
Yeah, and keeping in mind, too, that as far as amongst the major countries, no nation had as high a percentage of their population at war as the French did. Amongst the big powers, that is. I think, like, Bulgaria or Serbia might have outdone them amongst the minors. But anyway. So, at the same time, though, there was a bit of confidence in France in the 1920s, at least in the immediate aftermath, because, hey, we got Alsace-Lorraine back. The German military has been neutered. They're paying us reparations. At the same time, the French were involved in a few colonial campaigns that were stunning successes, including ones where they were integrating tanks and infantry. So things were looking up through the 20s. I would say that despite the awful casualties, which the French were probably the country that at the end of the war felt that yes, we lost a lot, we sacrificed a lot, but we achieved our objectives. You know.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it
Anyway,
that way. But
yeah, but once again, high cost, and also I also think that for us, in the end, Germany did rearm. The Nazis came in. They retook Alsace-Lorraine, right? Um, then the French had to watch in horror as many Alsatians joined the German army in World War II willingly, which one of them most famously wrote an account called The Forgotten Soldier, which is one of the most horrific accounts of war you can ever read. That's about an Alsatian fight on the Eastern Front, by the way. Anyway, so yeah, just a few thoughts I have on France in the conflict. You got
do,
any thoughts yourself?
do you think that when they built the Maginot Line, that they were thinking that if they could get the Germans to attack it, it could be Verdun 2.0?
No, the idea with the Maginot Line is twofold. One, it's considered to be strong enough to it'll keep the Germans out of French territory. And remember, you want to protect Alsace-Lorraine. You just lost a lot of men to get it back, right? And before that, we're talking decades of propaganda aimed at one day we will retrieve French land that was stolen from us in 1871. So you want to protect that land too. But also keeping in mind, the French in 1940, they're expecting the Germans to bypass the Maginot Line and go through Belgium. So the Maginot Line is also partially seen as a way to force the Germans into a predictable attack lane.
I see.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, people used to make fun and be like, "Oh, Maginot Line, they built them, they just stepped around it." I'm like, well, yeah, the French expected them to step around it. They're not stupid. I mean, they're going to make a major mistake with the Ardennes Forest, of course, but they're not that dumb.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, the Maginot Line is, it's like the French had doctrine of attack in World War One. Well, by the time you get to World War Two, the fortress school is firmly in charge, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it was because of that demographic shock when they realized that because of all the young men who didn't go on to have children, that the incoming class of young men who would be eligible for service was literally going to be half, and it would be that way for several years. So their military preparedness for the next couple of decades was compromised in terms of manpower.
It's interesting, though, how much their military atrophied after World War One, because by the time the war is over, I mean, the French are really good integrating infantry and tanks, right? And that integration just slows down after the war. At the same time, when the First World War is over, the French have the largest air force of all the countries involved. By the time you get to the 1930s, the French Air Force is dysfunctional. They actually have problems filling quotas to build aircraft. So, yeah, interesting. Militarily, the war's over. France ends 1918 with a good reputation, and it doesn't go anywhere. One of the only Frenchmen to really put forth some ideas on armored tactics was Charles de Gaulle. Although I don't think his work was heavily read in Germany or anything. It's not like he was considered like a brilliant armored theorist, but he's one of the guys in France pushing for something more like a tank division, if you will. Anyway, any other thoughts on France, or do you want to move to the British?
I'm ready to move on to Perfidious Albion.
Oh yes, one of the best nicknames ever, right?
Yeah, I can't help but love that nickname. And I guess we did
Perfidious
see
Albion.
one example of the British being a bit tricky by screwing over the Tsar in favor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
What were they thinking with that?
They just didn't want Russian ships in the Adriatic.
Yeah, that's a crucial thing about Britain is that British foreign policy, since roughly I'd say the War of the Spanish Succession, is predicated on two things. One, no powerful country should control Flanders. Flanders being our direct access to European markets and whatnot. At the same time, whoever is a European power that we consider the most powerful of the European powers, we're against them and need to limit whatever they're doing. Right?
Right.
So, War of the Spanish Succession to Napoleon, it was France. Post Napoleonic Wars, it eventually becomes Russia, which leads to the Crimean War and the Great Game in Central Asia and all the rest. And their decision to be like, we don't want Russian ships in the Adriatic because, I mean, that's almost like a knee jerk British thing, if you will. You know, decades of anti Russian foreign policy. And even though now you're allies with Russia, Russia's alliance was more close with the French than it was with the British. Anyway, so now Germany's the new kid on the block that we got to limit. So that plays a large role in what determines Britain's actions in the war, I would say, is the need to control Flanders and limit and hopefully defeat whichever nation is considered the strongest. But what makes this one different than other conflicts is that, you know, in the Napoleonic Wars, Britain is the economic powerhouse of the world because of their banking system, which allows them to spread money and gold all over Europe to finance it. And keeping in mind, Britain just didn't care what kind of debt they racked up. I mean, they only repaid the debt for the Napoleonic Wars 2 years ago. All right?
Really?
I mean, yes. 2 years ago, they repaid it.
Okay, I had no idea. Holy shit.
Well, yeah, actually, what Britain did in the Napoleonic Wars is very important in the history of finances. They essentially ran deficits that everybody thought were fantastical. I mean, that's how committed they are to crushing Napoleon. They're going to take what was considered accepted economic theory and just take a piss on it. Well, that allowed them to have other countries fight their battles for them. You know, I mean, of course, Wellington landed in Spain and fought at Waterloo, but as the old joke goes, Britain will fight Napoleon until the last Austrian soldier dies. Well, by the time we get to the First World War, though, while Britain is still economically, you know, one of the most powerful countries, they're not as juiced as they were in the early 1800s. It's just not there. So World War One's also interesting for them because they have to prop up the French. The French don't have the manpower to fully stand toe to toe with the Germans, and the British can't just afford to buy people off. They can't just siphon money to the Russians, for instance. So they have to commit soldiers to the continent in numbers never before seen by the British. You know, and yeah, so they will be committing soldiers to the Western Front in large armies and these massive offensives like Passchendaele and the Somme and all the rest. Yeah, so anyway, that's how Britain kind of gets involved in the conflict. You got any thoughts?
Um, Not all that many on Britain, really. I feel like, yeah, like you said, it was for them a departure from their tradition of trying to fight on the periphery and using other people's manpower. I know that there was a big controversy about the British generals from this war, where you have especially the New Zealanders and Australians lament the incompetence of all of them, and then there have been some revisionists more recently who said they weren't actually that bad. I guess it's only really started in the 80s, but based on what I have read of World War One, I'm pretty rusty on the Western Front, but I can't recall any British victories in this war. And of course, there's also the whole Gallipoli affair, but somewhat separate.
If you're considering what the British are doing with battles like the Somme and Passchendaele, if you consider it in an attritional sense, it's kind of a victory. I mean, they are chewing up German units. But you know, I'm of the opinion that in the end these are defeats. You know, Haig wasn't launching those attacks just to chew up Germans. No, he wanted a breakthrough to smash the lines. Yeah, I'm pretty hard on a lot of the British generals in the upper crust, but I mean, I don't want. They're not all a bunch of nimrods. Not all of them are Lord Melchick from Blackadder. Okay.
Yeah.
But one thing that's interesting is the BEF were very, very good. Some of that come from the Boer War, so the British had really emphasized marksmanship. So British infantry proved to be very good on defense in 1914. Really, really did well. But yeah, that's kind of the British for you anyway. It's like a small army. The generals might be so-so, but the soldiers and the officers at the lower ranks are second to none, right? I mean, it's the way it was in the Napoleonic Wars too. Royal Navy's interesting. It's bigger than the High Seas Fleet. Uh, that said, as infamously at Jutland, a lot of their battle cruisers are going to go kaboom due to poor shell handling, if you will. But also that did show that there were certain problems in the Royal Navy. The battle cruiser concept turned out not to really be the best idea in the world.
Yeah,
And
it's a
very
little too
soon,
light.
type of warship. What's up?
A little too light when it came to being able to take hits.
Yeah, and keeping in mind the battle cruisers, I mean, their point wasn't to be in a major gun line. It was to hunt down cruisers and sink them. That was their thoughts, and they were effective at that. At the Battle of the Falklands, for instance.
I guess they were also pretty good at naval bombardments.
Yeah, it is heavy cannons, but I would say that the Royal Navy is vital to this war. Of course, they blockade the Germans, and that blockade is one of the leading reasons why Germany is going to lose the war. There are some historians who think it's the decisive factor in the war. Don't know if I go that far, but man, is it important. I mean, the kind of food shortages. By 1918, the Germans and the Austrians in Russia and Romania are essentially stealing food so they can feed their own people.
Damn.
And yeah, just damage it does to the German economy cannot be overstated. And that said, in other ways, all things considered, the Royal Navy, I would say, probably didn't perform as well as some people would have liked. Like, for instance, at Jutland, they took very heavy casualties. And I do think that kind of stung on the British because they were used to, they're used to just naval dominance, right? And Jutland is not Trafalgar. In fact, if anything, the British Admiralty felt particularly embarrassed because of how poorly they did in the night actions at Jutland, which led to the British really emphasizing night tactics later on, which they were very good at in World War II, by the way. The only people probably better than them were the Japanese, and maybe even not by that much. Not really discussed much, but the British were really good at night tactics, night naval tactics. But anyway, so that's some of your stuff going into it. The Royal Navy, of course, had been massively expanded in the first few years before the war, to answer the High Seas Fleet. And that's the only thoughts I got, really.
Okay, well, I don't have too much else to add. I guess, as we mentioned earlier, to some extent, the British also employed a lot of Portuguese soldiers and some Irishmen as well in their trenches.
Yeah, they brought the Portuguese in. It's funny you mention Ireland. There's a poem about the Easter Uprising in 1916 that has this line where he says, England bade our wild geese go so that small nations might be free. Right? So this idea of like England being like, oh, we must keep Belgium free, but you Irishmen, you got to stay in the empire, you maggots,
Yeah. Yeah, Belgium and Luxembourg, those are the countries whose independence matters the most.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, they'll eventually call the Portuguese into the conflict. They don't do so well though, and of course a lot of the British soldiers will be Irish, but of course it's a poor country. Poor people tend to join the military, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, any other thoughts on Britain on this one?
Not really. I mean, I guess, but for both Britain and France, I feel like World War One had the impact of really knocking down their standing in the world in the long run. I mean, obviously World War Two contributed as well, but World War One, I think, is where their central power became endangered, and now their ability to hold on to these global empires was very much compromised. Whereas before, I feel like they had possibly the resources and certainly the confidence to keep going, And I think that this was an event which really shook them to the core. And then once
But
you have World War
long
II come
run,
around,
I,
that's game,
there's
set,
like
and
a
match.
short term. They get a short term confidence boost though. In many cases, I mean, the empire. Like I said, the British Empire reaches its largest extent in 1921. That's at its peak. Hell, God, I forgot to mention what the French. When the French returned to Syria, Palestine area, apparently this French general went up to the tomb of Saladin, kicked it, and said, "Wake up! The crescent has fallen to the cross."
Wow.
I know, but I know what you're saying. Like long term, and especially into the 1930s with the Great Depression and fears over communism, fascism, and Nazism. But in those first few years after World War One, I feel like these both Britain and France, they're like, man, we lost a lot of guys, but damn, we've achieved our objectives. And our enemies are screwed.
Yeah.
I mean, look, we're breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The crescent has fallen to the cross.
The Ottoman Empire is vanished.
Yes. Although there's enough of Turkey left to still work as a bulwark against the Russians, right?
Yeah, I guess that's true.
But we get to devour all these other territories like Syria and Palestine and Iraq and all the rest. But yeah, I mean, in the long term, and also it doesn't help that World War II gets fought because, World War II so much is the sequel to this war, is its continuation in many ways. I mean, Winston Churchill had the opinion that it was the same war, just happened to have a 20-year truce.
Hmm. Although, I mean, Italy
Yeah.
switching sides between the wars, I think that was the key to the whole puzzle.
What about Japan switching sides?
I guess that one's pretty major too. Although in World War One, didn't they just basically seize a few German colonies in China and that was it?
Roughly, yeah. They also contributed a few ships to the Mediterranean, but no, I mean, maybe they sent a battleship or two, but nothing too heavy, or not too much. Still, they were allies. They got to show up at the Versailles conference. They tried to get some kind of peace in there that rejected white supremacy or something like that, or something to that effect. That didn't work out.
Yeah, of course, all the Europeans assembled there laughed.
Yeah, France and Britain. I mean, Britain and Japan at this time were allies. That was the same was long that had been went on for a while, and it was really American pressure with the Washington Naval Conference that ended the British-Japanese alliance, which is very bad for Britain because they really had relied on that Japanese alliance to maintain the situation in the Pacific, and now they no longer have that alliance. Now they have to contend with a rapidly expanding and very competent Japanese Navy. But yeah, so I guess that concludes it up. I'll let you know how Paths of Glory goes next week.
All right.
Let's check the rest of the super chats if we got any.
We have 3 more. We have another by
Okay.
Nathan Center for $4.99. He says, simply, I agree. In reference to, I guess, something we were talking about at the time. So thank you, Nathan.
Or somebody else, maybe elsewhere. But anyway, CS Ventura, $5. One more. What's your take on France's call to the attack during World War One, in keeping with their schizo military history? Also on their 1917 mutinies. I think we did go over that one, though.
Yeah, actually, I'm pretty sure
that
we were finishing the conversation on that by the time I saw the super chat.
Okay.
But
well,
yeah,
look,
so I guess just to summarize, the French were interested in the idea of the attack. That was their dominant doctrine, and basically they just ran out of the men to do it, so they had to go to the more of the fortress model.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth in that. They lost a lot of men, but also those French, I mean, at least in the short term, those French mutinies meant that they could no longer launch those kinds of attacks. And, I mean, God, the French army really got chewed up in 1915 as well. It doesn't get discussed too much because 1915 in the West, there wasn't those, like, truly massive Verdun-Somme level battles, but the French casualties were something like, I think they were lost, like, 3 times as many men as the Germans did in 1915.
Yeah, basically, if you want to be a decent World War One commander, my piece of advice would be don't attack.
Yeah, well, at least don't attack right into like a super trench or something.
Yeah. But
Nathan,
unless you have a dangling flank or overwhelming force, or you're going to couple it with some sort of naval landing to get around the trench, or whatever the case might be, just let them come to you, and then counterattack.
yeah, but they're all thinking like eventually we'll get the breakthrough, and later on they start integrating the weapons systems better. Technology is getting better. But anyway, Nathan Center 499 off topic, but
I assume
I'm
he
sorry,
means I
off
never
topic.
catch you guys live.
What'd you say?
I assume he means I never get to see you guys live.
Okay, well I'm glad you are, man. Love your Byzantine videos, and Sean, the Battle of Prairie Grove was more important than you think. Lol. If it's so important, man, just let us know, and we'll do an entire Prairie Grove episode just for you. Okay.
Yeah, the Prairie Grove super spectacular.
Good battlefield to visit, though. By the way, very well preserved.
So as things stand, our grand winner of the evening is CS Ventura with a total of $35.
Yeah, I think that also beats out the people from last time as well. So yeah, send us your address, man, and let us know what kind of book you'd be interested in.
And
I
also,
got quite a few decent ones here.
yeah, who you want to receive your prize from. That's also important, so we know who should be looking for a book. But yeah, so that was all we have to say about World War One for now. It looks like there might have been a $3 one somewhere.
Oh yeah, but I'm
Or
getting pretty. I'm getting pretty sleepy over here right now.
okay,
I was up really early this morning, and when you're trying to, yeah, sure. Yeah. When you're playing as a Kaiser and you're trying to liberate France, it drains you.
yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, you got to fight all the enemies on each side, so it's
I mean, it's all up to me, man. I mean, Danny's playing the Austria-Hungarians. I mean, he's punching above his weight as he usually does with the damn Austrians, right?
yeah. I think that's why he likes playing as them.
Yeah, he was like, "Yeah, I'll be the Austrians." I'm like, "Of course you will." Anyway, man, you got anything else to add?
No, I'm just gonna send my email real fast to Nathan.
All right. Well,
But
hey, thank y'all. Thank y'all, everybody. We'll see you next Sunday. You got any ideas for next Sunday?
not immediately, no. How about you?
Uh, not this very moment. I mean, who knows? Maybe something will happen in world affairs, right?
Yeah, I mean, you never know. Hard to predict, I guess.
I know they're still churning through the cabinet picks right now, right?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't. It's not entirely certain whether what's her face Nero Tandon will make it or not.
Yeah, I heard Joe Manchin was trying to stop that or something.
Yes, Joe Manchin and a lot of Republicans are against it, but also
And
a lot of the progressives who believe in the economic left are against it, but some other progressives think that she's the best bet. It's weird. I don't know. It's a whole thing I don't want to get into.
yeah, me either, man. Um, all right, yeah, we'll figure out something for next Sunday, definitely.
All right.
Um,
Well, thank you everyone who showed up tonight, and we will see you next Sunday with something or other. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian. This is Sean. Good night.